Pay $20,000 or don't bother showing up to the wedding. That's the message I got from my parents after everything I'd done for this family. And no, they weren't joking. They expected me to pay for my sister's wedding, dress it up like a family contribution, and smile quietly from the back row. When I refused, they made it clear I was no longer invited. My sister laughed in my face. "She's nothing without family money," she said. That night I booked a one-way ticket to the Maldives with the exact $20,000 they demanded from me. What happened next? Let's just say, things got real. The next morning their phones blew up, credit cards declined, power shut off, water disconnected, bank accounts frozen, 72 missed calls. I didn't answer a single one. They thought I was just the quiet daughter, the obedient one, the one they could squeeze dry and toss aside. But this time I wasn't playing along. I was done funding their fantasy while they stripped me of my dignity. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, the golden daughter's wedding would be in ruins, and the truth behind our perfect family would unravel right at the altar. And for once, I wouldn't be the one left apologizing. Angela Monroe was 32 years old, a financial analyst who had built a quiet life for herself in Boston. She wasn't glamorous or dramatic like her younger sister Crystal, but she was steady, dependable, the kind of woman who worked late nights and lived within her means. To the outside world, she seemed perfectly in control, but inside her family, she had always been seen as something else entirely, not a daughter or a sister in the truest sense, but a source of money, a steady stream of help no one ever acknowledged. The night that truth became impossible to ignore started with a single phone call. It was close to midnight when Angela's phone buzzed on her nightstand. She rubbed her tired eyes and glanced at the screen. It was her mother. A late-night call wasn't unusual. Her mother seemed to have no boundaries when it came to Angela's time. Still, something about the timing made her stomach twist. She answered with a soft, "Hi, Mom," but what she heard in return was not a greeting. It was a demand. Her mother's voice came through sharp and cold like a blade against glass. "Angela, your sister's wedding is in 3 weeks. You need to contribute $20,000. That's what family does. And if you can't manage that, don't bother showing up." Angela sat upright in bed, the words hitting her like a slap. 20,000, she repeated, as if saying the number aloud would make it more reasonable, more believable. But her mother's tone left no room for misunderstanding. There was no warmth, no hesitation, just a transaction disguised as an ultimatum. Before Angela could even form a reply, another voice cut in from the background. Crystal's smug and mocking, just loud enough to carry through the line. "She's nothing without family money anyway." Angela's hand trembled as she pressed the phone tighter to her ear. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She wasn't just being asked for money, she was being belittled, reduced to nothing more than a wallet dismissed by the very people who were supposed to stand beside her. She tried to steady her voice. "Mom, Crystal, this isn't fair. You can't just—" Her mother interrupted, harsher this time. "Don't make a scene. Your sister deserves the best. This is her time. Either you show up with the money or you don't come at all. Those are your options." The call ended abruptly, the line going dead before Angela could answer. She stared at the phone in her hand, her reflection caught in the black screen. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and she felt the sting of tears pressing against her eyes. But more than sadness, there was something heavier building inside her, a deep, suffocating anger. Angela set the phone down and pushed herself out of bed. She walked through her small apartment, the familiar space suddenly claustrophobic. The tidy bookshelf, the modest couch, the potted plant by the window, all of it seemed to mock her. She had built this life on her own paycheck by paycheck, while her family drained her bit by bit, always expecting, never grateful. Her thoughts spun back through the years, like pages torn from a book. She remembered the time her mother had called her during a business meeting, panicked about an overdue utility bill, and Angela had quietly paid it off. She remembered Crystal crying about her maxed-out credit cards, promising she would change, and Angela covering the balance anyway. She remembered her father's hospital stay the bill's insurance didn't cover, and how she had emptied her savings account to make sure he survived. Each memory pressed against her chest like a weight layering over the one before it until she could hardly breathe. What had she received in return? Not gratitude, not respect, not even recognition. Just more demands, more expectations, more ways to prove that her role was never as a daughter, but as the financier of the family. And now, with the wedding looming, her mother and sister had finally stripped away even the illusion of love. They wanted $20,000, not her presence. If she refused, she was out, banished. Angela sank onto the couch, her body rigid, her eyes staring at nothing. The words replayed in her head like a cruel chorus. Don't bother showing up. She's nothing without family money. The longer she sat there, the more the sting of their words turned into a slow, simmering burn. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. She had always hoped foolishly maybe that one day her parents would see her, really see her. That one day Crystal would treat her as a sister, not a servant. But this phone call had shattered that hope completely. For years, she had been the quiet one, the dependable one, the daughter who never said no. She had believed that sacrifice was love. But sitting alone in her Boston apartment that night, Angela realized that in her family's eyes her love had no value without a dollar sign attached. A gust of wind rattled the window and Angela rose to her feet. She pressed her palms against the glass, staring out at the city lights blurred by the fog. Somewhere out there, families were sharing laughter, warmth, acceptance. And here she was, cut off, reduced to a figure on a ledger. She thought of her mother's icy tone of Crystal's smug laughter, and a sharp pain spread across her chest. It was more than rejection. It was betrayal. Angela took a deep breath, her reflection faint in the window. For the first time in years, she let herself feel the truth that had always been there, but she had been too afraid to face. She was not loved by her family for who she was. She was tolerated for what she provided. Her pulse began to steady as that truth settled over her. She wasn't just hurt, she was angry. Anger had a way of clarifying things, of stripping away illusions. Tonight had shown her exactly where she stood. They had drawn the line cold and clear, pay or disappear. Angela turned away from the window and sank back into her couch. She hugged a cushion against her chest, holding herself together as the weight of the night pressed down. She knew she couldn't stay like this forever, paralyzed, torn between love and resentment. At some point, she would have to choose. And though she couldn't yet see the full shape of what was coming, she felt the first flicker of resolve begin to burn inside her. In that quiet apartment with the echoes of her mother's ultimatum still ringing in her ears, Angela understood something she had never allowed herself to say aloud. The family she had been clinging to might never truly have been hers. And once she admitted that a question rose in her mind, fierce and unrelenting. If they saw her as nothing more than money, what would happen when the money was gone? That question lingered sharp as a blade. As Angela sat alone in the silence of her Boston night, the first seeds of defiance taking root. Angela sat there in the quiet of her apartment, the echoes of her mother's ultimatum still ringing in her ears, and her thoughts began to drift back not just to the conversation, but to the long road that had brought her here. The hurt was fresh, but it was also familiar, an echo of wounds she had carried since childhood. She could see it all as clearly as if she were flipping through an old family album, each memory layered with the same message: Crystal was adored, Angela was tolerated. When she was a child, her mother had a way of speaking that made Angela feel smaller than she already was. At every school concert, Crystal's name would be praised. Look at how talented she is, her mother would gush, while Angela, standing nearby, waited for some scrap of recognition. Her report cards were never good enough even when she brought home straight A's. Crystal's so much more creative, her mother would say with a smile that cut deeper than any outright insult. Angela learned early on that no matter what she achieved, she would always be the background figure, the plain shadow next to Crystal's shining light. Crystal, of course, played her role with ease. She was the golden child, the one who could spill juice on the carpet and laugh it off, knowing her mother would clean it up with a smile. Angela, on the other hand, was scolded for every small mistake. If Crystal forgot her homework, it was brushed aside. If Angela misplaced a pencil, it was treated like a flaw in her character. This endless comparison etched itself into Angela's heart, making her feel like she was perpetually second best, destined to come in last in her own family. But as she grew older, Angela found herself filling in the cracks her parents and sister left behind. When her father fell ill years ago and needed surgery, the insurance covered most but not all of the costs. She remembered sitting in her small office looking at her modest savings account and transferring nearly everything she had without hesitation. $8,000 gone in an instant, and she didn't think twice, because she thought that was what love demanded. The relief on her mother's voice that night had almost felt like gratitude, but it faded within days, swallowed up by more requests. Then there was Crystal, always living just beyond her means, always convinced she was one step away from a glamorous career. Angela could recall the desperate call from her sister when the credit card companies were circling. "It's just this once," Crystal had pleaded, voice dripping with drama. Angela had worked overtime shifts, had skipped meals out, had worn the same old coats through the biting Boston winters to cover that debt. 1,000 here, 3,000 there, it all blurred together, until Angela realized she had spent enough to buy herself a new car, but instead, she had bought Crystal another chance to keep pretending. And the bills, those endless household bills. The gas that somehow never got paid, the electricity notices that always appeared like clockwork. Month after month, Angela quietly logged in, entered her information, and covered the costs. Sometimes $100, sometimes more. She didn't keep track at first. She thought it was her duty, thought maybe they really couldn't manage. But years passed, and it became clear that what her family couldn't manage wasn't the money, it was the discipline. She paid, and they forgot, as though the debts had simply evaporated into thin air. All those sacrifices should have meant something. But instead of easing the weight on her shoulders, they became expectations carved into stone. Each time Angela stepped up, her family grew more certain that she would always step up. Gratitude disappeared, replaced by assumption. "Angela will cover it" became the unspoken truth of the household. When she asked for nothing in return, they gave her less than nothing silence where thanks should have been dismissal, where respect should have lived. She remembered one Christmas vividly. Crystal had been showered with gifts extravagant and unnecessary, while Angela unwrapped a generic sweater 2 sizes too large. She had smiled anyway because that was what was expected. Later that night, when the lights twinkled on the tree and her family laughed together, Angela slipped away to the kitchen sink, washing dishes alone. Not one person noticed she was gone. That, more than any gift or lack thereof, told her everything she needed to know about her place in the family. Now, sitting in her Boston apartment with her mother's ultimatum still echoing, Angela understood the full shape of that truth. She had been invisible for years, not in the literal sense, but in the way that mattered most. Her love, her sacrifices, her hard work. None of it made her a daughter in their eyes. She was simply the backup plan, the one they leaned on when things went wrong, the one they could ignore when things went right. She was the other daughter, the spare, the dependable figure who never needed the spotlight because she never expected it. The anger building in her chest was no longer just about the $20,000. It was about the years of being unseen, the years of bending until she nearly broke, only to be told it wasn't enough. Every dollar she had given, every hour she had worked, every dream she had postponed for the sake of her family, those were invisible too, erased by the cruel simplicity of her mother's words. Contribute or stay away. Angela pressed her hand to her forehead, feeling the weight of all those years crash down at once. She thought of the hours she had spent in fluorescent-lit offices, crunching numbers while the city slept, just to keep up with the endless stream of obligations her family created. She thought of the nights she had walked home alone in the dark, exhausted and hungry, but still determined to transfer money so her sister could have a night out. She thought of the countless moments when she could have said no but didn't, because some part of her believed that one day it would be enough. But tonight, for the first time, she could see the pattern clearly. It was never enough. It was never going to be enough. Angela leaned back against the couch. her eyes closing as tears slipped free. They weren't tears of weakness, but of recognition. She was grieving something she had lost long ago, the illusion that she mattered to her family as anything more than a resource. She had been the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who filled in the gaps. But in the end, she had been little more than a shadow carrying everyone else, while no one carried her. In that painful clarity, Angela felt something shift. It was faint, fragile, like the first crack of light beneath a closed door. She was beginning to see that the life she had built for others had cost her the life she should have built for herself. And though she wasn't ready yet to take that final step, the awareness alone was enough to change her. As the night stretched on, Angela sat in her apartment surrounded by silence. But she was no longer the same woman who had answered her mother's call a few hours before. She was beginning to understand her own worth, and with that understanding came the first whisper of defiance. The weight of her family's disregard lingered in Angela's chest as she replayed the scenes of her past. Yet it wasn't only old memories that hurt. It was the fresh ones, the moments when the truth of her position in the family could no longer be ignored. One such moment came not long before the ultimatum call, and it had branded itself into her mind like a scar. It had been Crystal's birthday, an occasion their mother insisted on celebrating with fanfare and indulgence. Angela had gone along as she always did, hoping perhaps this time it might feel different. The party was held at a trendy Italian restaurant on the edge of the suburbs, the kind of place where the waiters hovered with polished smiles and the walls glowed in soft amber light. Angela had arrived straight from work, still carrying the stress of the day on her shoulders. She hadn't wanted to go, but guilt had nudged her into the car and down the highway. By the time she walked into the restaurant, her sister was already surrounded by a crowd of friends, her laughter ringing out like bells. Crystal glowed with attention, leaning back in her chair, while their mother clapped her hands and called her "my shining star." Angela slid quietly into an empty seat near the edge of the table. No one really noticed her arrival. Their focus was entirely on Crystal, who was busy describing her new Lexus parked outside. "I deserve it," she was saying, twirling her wine glass between her fingers. "You work hard, you reward yourself. That's how it goes." Their mother nodded enthusiastically, her eyes shining with pride as though her daughter had just solved some grand equation of life. Angela sat listening, her fork tracing absent circles on her plate. She had heard versions of this before, the bragging about trips, the endless talk about expensive shoes or glittering plans. It always struck her, though, how little of it was really Crystal's doing. Those things had been made possible because Angela had quietly handled bills, debts, and emergencies so that her sister's money could stretch toward luxuries. Tonight, however, she wasn't in the mood to silently endure it. It happened without thought, a slip of honesty masked as humor. When one of Crystal's friends asked how she afforded so much at her age, Angela leaned in slightly and said with a wry smile, "She's very good at finding people to pick up the check." The words were meant to be a half-joke, a jab softened by a laugh. For one moment, Angela thought maybe they would be brushed aside as banter, but the silence that followed was sharp, like the crack of glass breaking. Crystal's face froze mid-smile, her cheeks coloring as her eyes narrowed into daggers. "Excuse me," she hissed, her voice tight enough to slice through the warm chatter. The table went quiet. Angela felt the air grow heavy around her. She tried to shrug it off, tried to make it seem less than it was. "Just teasing," she said lightly, forcing a chuckle. But Crystal wasn't laughing. Her lips tightened, and she pushed back her chair with a loud scrape against the polished floor. Without another word, she stood and stormed out, her heels clicking like gunshots as she disappeared through the door. All eyes shifted to Angela. Her mother was the first to move, hurrying after Crystal with cooing words and flustered hands. "Don't cry, sweetheart. Don't let her ruin your night," she said as she trailed her younger daughter, leaving Angela frozen at the table. Within minutes, their mother returned, her face flushed with irritation. She didn't scold Crystal for the scene, didn't comment on her dramatic exit. Instead, she turned on Angela. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded in a low, sharp tone meant for Angela alone but audible enough to those nearby. "You always have to ruin things." Couldn't you just let your sister enjoy her birthday for once? Angela's stomach turned. For once, it seemed that every celebration revolved around Crystal while she was asked only to attend quietly, to smile and stay invisible. And yet now she was painted as the disruptive one, the troublemaker. She tried to swallow her indignation, but her silence only made it worse. Her mother shook her head, whispering with disdain. "Honestly, Angela, I don't know what's gotten into you. You're becoming bitter and it's embarrassing." The rest of the evening unraveled quickly. Conversation resumed, but it was stiff, uneasy, punctuated by glances at Angela that made her feel like an intruder at her own family's table. She ate little, her appetite gone, and slipped away early without saying goodbye. No one stopped her. No one even noticed. The aftermath was even worse. Word traveled swiftly among relatives. At Sunday dinner with cousins, Angela could feel the whispers around her. An aunt leaned close and muttered, "Why would you embarrass your sister like that? People are saying you're jealous." Another cousin sent a text that read, "I heard you snapped at Crystal. What's going on with you?" Everywhere. Angela turned the narrative had already been spun. She was the jealous, sharp-tongued sister who couldn't let her sibling shine. It wasn't the joke that haunted her. It was the way the family seized it as proof of something they had always suspected. Angela was the difficult one, the bitter one, the one who, in their eyes, couldn't be happy for others. The irony cut deep. She had given years of her life to ease their burdens, to clear debts and cover bills, and yet one stray comment outweighed all of it. Walking home that night after the dinner where she had been branded jealous, Angela felt a hollowness spread inside her chest. The city lights blurred in her eyes, though she wasn't crying. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was the bitter clarity of realizing she had been living in a house of mirrors, where every reflection of her was distorted, every effort erased. To them, she wasn't the daughter who had saved them time and again. She was a problem to contain, a voice to silence, a presence to minimize. That night became a turning point, though she didn't know it then. It marked the moment when she began to see her family not just as ungrateful, but as fundamentally unjust. It was no longer about love or duty. It was about survival, hers. And though she would continue to endure their demands for a little while longer, a quiet ember of resistance had been lit within her. Angela could still feel the sting of that birthday dinner long after it ended. The whispers, the judgmental looks, the way her mother had rushed to comfort Crystal while leaving her alone at the table, it all hung in the air like smoke she couldn't clear. She told herself to push it aside to keep her head down, but the ache of being branded jealous and bitter gnawed at her in quiet moments. She thought perhaps it would pass, that if she kept working, kept paying, kept playing the role she always had, the storm would settle. But the storm was only gathering strength. A week later, the phone rang late in the evening. It was her mother, the sharp tone in her voice telling Angela this was no casual call. She braced herself as her mother launched into a familiar lecture. Crystal's wedding was approaching, her mother said, and there were expenses, big ones that still needed to be covered. The expectation was laid out with no hesitation. Angela was to provide $20,000 toward the celebration. It was presented not as a request, but as an obligation, a condition for her presence. Angela's hand tightened on the phone. $20,000. She thought of her modest savings account, the years of overtime hours, the careful budgeting that allowed her to have even that much. She thought of the countless bills she had already paid, the debts she had erased, the sacrifices she had made. But before she could even respond, her mother pressed on, and the conversation shifted from a demand for money to something far worse. Her mother's voice grew colder as she added that Angela would need to sign a statement, a promise, a guarantee that under no circumstance would she mention money to anyone connected to Crystal's fiancé. She was to keep silent about the bills she had paid, the debts she had erased, the way she had carried the family for years. "We don't want you embarrassing your sister," her mother said, the words clipped and precise. "You're not to bring up finances. Not in front of David. Not in front of his family." "Do you understand?" Angela sat in stunned silence. It wasn't enough that they wanted her money, they wanted her silence too. They wanted her to erase her own sacrifices, to pretend they had never happened, to let Crystal bask in a glow that had been built on Angela's hidden labor. The paper they wanted her to sign was not just a contract. It was a muzzle. It was a command to swallow her truth and pretend she was nothing more than a bystander, a background figure with no story of her own. The humiliation of it seared through her chest. She could picture the scene her mother was so carefully constructing, Crystal glowing in her gown, David's family smiling with admiration, her parents standing proud as though they had built something extraordinary. And Angela, silent in the corner, the invisible sister forbidden from speaking a word about the reality beneath the surface. They weren't simply asking for help, they were asking for her erasure. It was in that moment, with her mother's words slicing through the line, that Angela began to feel a new kind of anger. This wasn't the dull ache of neglect or the quiet sorrow of being overlooked. This was fire. This was rage that simmered in her blood, hot and undeniable. For years she had told herself that her sacrifices mattered, even if they went unacknowledged. For years she had clung to the hope that one day her parents might see her, might appreciate her, might love her not for what she could provide but for who she was. But the paper her mother demanded was proof of the truth: they would never see her. They didn't want to. Angela found her voice, though it trembled with the weight of everything she felt. "So you want my money," she said slowly, "and you want me to promise never to speak of it. You want me to erase myself so Crystal can look perfect." There was a pause on the line, the silence heavy, and then her mother's voice came back sharp as ever. "Don't be dramatic, Angela. This is about family. This is about supporting your sister. Don't make it about you." The words were a final blow. Don't make it about you. As if she had never been a part of it. As if her years of sacrifice were nothing. As if her very existence was an inconvenience to be managed. Angela hung up the phone with her hands trembling. Her chest tight, but her mind clear in a way it hadn't been before. The humiliation had done something to her. It had cracked open the shell of obedience she had carried for so long and revealed the anger, the defiance, the will to fight that had been buried beneath. She sat in the stillness of her apartment, the city lights outside her window blurring in the glass. The paper her mother wanted her to sign didn't exist yet, but she could imagine it: a line for her name, a line for her silence. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would never put her pen to it. For the first time, she let herself imagine a different path, one where she wasn't the invisible daughter, the family wallet, the scapegoat. One where she wasn't bound by their demands and their lies. It was terrifying, that thought. But it was also liberating. The humiliation that had once crushed her was now fuel. Every cruel word, every unfair demand, every time she had been told to be quiet or to give more, those became sparks feeding the fire inside her. And in that fire, Angela began to see the outline of something new. Not just resistance, but revenge. She didn't know exactly what shape it would take yet, but she knew this much: she would not give them her money, and she would not give them her silence. They had asked for her to disappear, but instead she would make herself impossible to ignore. Angela could still feel the humiliation seared into her chest after that call. It was one thing for her mother to demand money, that was expected by now. But to insist that she sign away her right to speak, to ask her to erase every sacrifice she had ever made, as though it had never happened, that was a cruelty Angela had not anticipated. She paced her apartment, the floor creaking beneath her steps, her hands trembling as anger and grief churned together inside her. She knew she could not endure much more. When the phone rang again the next evening, she almost ignored it, but habit pulled her to answer, and there was her mother's voice once more, sharp and relentless. The conversation picked up where the last one had left off. Money appearances Crystal's perfect image. Angela tried to hold her ground, her voice low and firm. "I've given more than enough. I won't be signing anything. I won't pretend this family's life hasn't been funded by me." Her mother's reply came like a whip crack. "Crystal is the one who matters. She's the real daughter. She's our blood, Angela. You never were." The words hung in the air, almost inaudible at first, but when they landed, they pierced her like a blade. Angela froze. For a long moment she thought perhaps she had misheard. Her heart pounded in her ears and her mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. On the other end, her mother's breath hitched as if she realized too late what had slipped out. But the damage was done. Angela stood rooted in her living room, staring at nothing as the truth reshaped everything she thought she knew. She was not their daughter. Not truly. Crystal was the one tied to them by blood. Angela was something else, an outsider who had been kept close enough to serve but never close enough to belong. Memories came rushing back sharp and clear now that she saw them through this new lens. The way her mother always lingered in her embrace with Crystal while Angela's hugs were brief, almost perfunctory. The way her mother proudly displayed Crystal's baby photos in ornate frames while Angela's were tucked into dusty albums rarely opened. The way her father never spoke much about Angela's childhood, dodging questions with vague responses, as though there was a chapter he was unwilling to revisit. And perhaps most damning of all, the way her mother had always insisted Crystal and Angela looked nothing alike, laughing it off as a quirk of genetics. Angela thought of all the moments she had swallowed the sting of favoritism, telling herself it was her imagination. Now she saw it wasn't her mind playing tricks. It was the truth her family had guarded, whether out of shame or indifference, she couldn't say. Her breath came shallow and fast as she sat down heavily on the couch. She wasn't theirs. Not in the way she thought. She had spent her entire life striving to earn love from people who had already decided she would never truly deserve it. She had drained her savings, bent her back, and broken her spirit to be seen. And all the while she had been nothing more than a convenient figure to them, a stand-in, a provider, an accessory to Crystal's golden glow. The grief of that realization was sharp, almost unbearable. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the tears that burned there. It wasn't just the lie itself. It was the years of living inside it. The birthdays where her presents were an afterthought. The holidays where Crystal's accomplishments were paraded and Angela's were ignored. The countless times she told herself that if she worked harder, gave more, she might one day be cherished. All of it now collapsed under the weight of a single sentence: Crystal is the real daughter. But even as her chest tightened with sorrow, another feeling began to rise, stronger and hotter than the grief. It was fury. It was the fire of betrayal, the flame of a woman who realized she had been used her entire life under the guise of love. She thought of every dollar she had sent their way, every bill she had covered, every hour of her life she had given over to a family that never once gave back. And she knew in that instant that the line had been crossed for good. Angela wiped her eyes, her body trembling with the shift of something profound. She was done trying to prove herself to them, done trying to earn what they had no intention of giving. If they saw her only as a wallet, a placeholder, a non-daughter, then she would show them what life looked like without her support. Her mother was still on the other end of the line, sputtering, perhaps trying to reel the words back to soften them, but Angela no longer cared. She let the voice fade into the background until it was just noise. She was thinking ahead now, thinking of the years she had left and how she refused to waste another moment of them being silent, being erased, being nothing. "I understand," she said finally, her voice low but steady, cutting across her mother's rambling. "More than you think." And then she hung up, placing the phone down with a calmness that belied the storm inside her. For a long time she sat in the quiet of her apartment, staring at the folder of receipts and records she had gathered over the years. Proof of everything she had done, proof of everything they had taken. It was no longer just a file to her, it was a weapon, one she intended to use. The truth had broken something inside Angela, but it had also freed her. If she was not their daughter, then she owed them nothing. No money, no silence, no loyalty. What they had demanded from her was no longer an obligation, it was an insult, and she would not allow them to insult her any longer. From that moment on, Angela's grief hardened into resolve. She would not be the invisible daughter anymore. She would not be the expendable figure in the shadow of Crystal's spotlight. She would make them see her not with love, but with consequence. They had stolen her belonging, her years, her peace. Now she would take back her power. Angela sat for a long time in the silence after hanging up on her mother, the truth about her place in the family still echoing in her mind. Her body felt heavy, her chest tight as though the words had stolen the air from her lungs. Yet beneath that weight, something new stirred a sense of release, sharp and unfamiliar. If she wasn't truly their daughter, then she owed them nothing. Every sacrifice she had made, every dollar she had poured into their lives had been given under the illusion of belonging. That illusion was gone now, shattered by her mother's careless admission. She rose from the couch, pacing across the narrow span of her apartment, her eyes catching on the glow of her laptop sitting silently on the desk. It had always been her tool for work, her gateway to the spreadsheets and financial statements that paid her bills and funded her family's endless demands. Tonight, though, it would be the doorway to something else entirely. She sat down, the cool surface of the keyboard under her fingers, and for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't calculating someone else's future. She was making a choice for her own. Her fingers hovered only a moment before she typed, "One-way flight Boston to Key West." The options appeared quickly on the screen, glossy photographs of sandy beaches and turquoise waters mocking the gray chill of the Boston night outside her window. She scrolled past the cheaper fares, past the round-trip options that implied hesitation. She clicked on a one-way ticket. The price, $20,000, almost exactly what her mother had demanded, flashed on the screen. For a moment her breath caught, but then she let out a laugh, sharp and bitter. They had wanted that money for Crystal's wedding. Instead, it would buy Angela her freedom. She clicked confirm, the numbers disappearing from her account with the same finality as a slammed door. The confirmation email landed in her inbox and she sat back in her chair, stunned by the simplicity of it. Years of entrapment undone with a few keystrokes. For the first time, she wasn't handing over her savings to cover someone else's mistake. She was using it to carve out her own escape. With the ticket purchased, a new urgency filled her veins. She rose and went to her closet, pulling out a worn suitcase that had seen little use beyond business trips. This time it would hold something far more precious than clothes. She folded garments mechanically, jeans, sweaters, a swimsuit she had never dared wear in public. But the most important item wasn't fabric. She crossed to her desk and pulled open the drawer that held a plain manila folder thick with paper. Inside were years of bank transfers, utility bills, credit card statements, receipts for surgeries and repairs, all the evidence of her silent labor. Angela placed the folder carefully on top of her clothes, her hands lingering on it as though it were a living thing. This was her ledger, her history, her truth. For years it had been nothing more than a collection of numbers, a secret burden she carried alone. Now it was her shield, her proof, her weapon. If her family tried to deny, to smear, to twist the story, this file would speak louder than words. She zipped the suitcase closed with deliberate care, as though sealing away the last chapter of her old life. She paused in the middle of her apartment, looking around at the small, tidy space she had built for herself. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The framed photo of her college graduation sat on the shelf, her smile in it tentative, as though even then she had been unsure of her worth. The stack of unpaid bills from her family lay unopened on the counter, a silent reminder of the chains she was cutting. Her eyes swept across it all, and she whispered to herself, "I don't owe them anything. Not anymore." The words surprised her. They felt foreign, as though she were hearing them for the first time, yet they rang with undeniable truth. She repeated them again, louder this time, her voice trembling with the force of it. "I don't owe them anything." Fear crept in alongside the exhilaration. What if she failed? What if running away left her more alone than she could bear? The thought of stepping onto a plane with no plan, no family, no safety net, just herself and a suitcase was terrifying. But the fear did not outweigh the clarity she felt. It was a sharp kind of fear, the kind that comes when standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the only way forward is to jump. Angela pressed her palm against the suitcase, grounding herself. She could still hear her mother's voice, cruel and dismissive, calling Crystal the true daughter. She thought of every slight, every dismissal, every time she had been silenced. Each memory added fuel to the fire in her chest. Fear was natural, but surrender was no longer an option. She stood at her window, looking out over the city lights, the traffic humming in the distance. Boston had been her cage, the place where she had played her part dutifully, always the provider, always the overlooked one. But in just a matter of hours, she would leave it behind. Key West wasn't just a destination. It was the first place she had chosen for herself, free of obligation, free of demands. Angela took a deep breath and whispered the words again, steady this time, as though cementing them into her bones. I don't owe them anything. The truth of it settled over her like armor, fragile, yet powerful. For the first time in her life, she was stepping into a future that belonged solely to her. Angela sat in her narrow airplane seat, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow as the flight attendants moved quietly up and down the aisle. The hum of the engines was steady, a low vibration that pressed against her chest as she leaned toward the oval window. Outside, the city of Boston was shrinking beneath her, a patchwork of yellow lights scattered like jewels across the dark. For a moment, she could see the Charles River cutting through it, all the streets and bridges glimmering faintly as if mocking the life she was leaving behind. As the plane climbed higher, the familiar outlines blurred and dissolved into nothing but clouds. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and felt something uncoil deep in her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about which bill was due, which excuse her mother would invent, or what disaster Crystal would dump onto her lap. All that weight was still down there in Boston, shrinking along with the skyline. The higher they rose, the lighter she felt, as though gravity itself had loosened its grip on her. She tried to remind herself that this wasn't a vacation, not yet. It was an escape. It was the first breath after years of drowning. Her palms were damp, her heartbeat uneven, but instead of dread, she felt a strange exhilaration. She had done something irreversible. She had walked away, boarded a plane with her savings, and chosen her own freedom over their control. Her mother's voice, sharp and unforgiving, still echoed in her head. No money, no wedding. But here in the cabin air. It began to sound smaller, less powerful. For so long she had believed she couldn't exist outside of their approval, but now she was beginning to taste what life felt like without their chains. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her jacket, rattling against the metal armrest. She hesitated already, knowing whose name would appear on the screen. When she pulled it out, the glow of Crystal's message was like a flare in the darkness. You can run, but you'll never get away from us. Don't think you can humiliate this family and get off free. Angela read it twice, her stomach tightening. The words dripped with the same venom. Crystal had always carried the same superiority that had poisoned their childhood and carried into adulthood. For a flicker of a moment, Angela's hand shook and the old fear threatened to return. The fear of being cast out, of being unloved, of being punished for daring to step out of line. But then she remembered the folder in her bag, stuffed with every receipt, every payment, every proof of what she had given. She had her truth, and with that truth came power. She turned the phone face down on the tray table, refusing to let Crystal's threats take root. The message didn't scare her the way it might have just a week ago. Instead, it hardened her resolve. If anything, Crystal's venom only proved how right she had been to leave. There was no love in that house, no real bond. There was only control, and Angela had finally severed the cord. She pictured them back in Boston, Crystal pacing the living room in a designer dress she hadn't paid for, their mother muttering about appearances and shame. Soon, Angela thought they would feel the full weight of what it meant to live without her. Soon their cards would decline, their lights would flicker off, their carefully curated image would collapse. The thought steadied her, a quiet fire burning in her chest. She looked out of the window again. The clouds parted, and the dark Atlantic stretched beneath the plane like an endless void, the stars sharp and glittering above it. Angela felt small but not insignificant. For years, she had been the background character in her own life, the one who made things work so others could shine. Now she was finally stepping into her own story, a story where she was not the wallet, not the scapegoat, not the quiet one in the shadows. She was terrified, yes, but her fear was laced with something sweet and heady hope. She closed her eyes and let herself imagine the days ahead. Not the details, not the logistics, just the feeling. The sun warming her skin. The sound of waves instead of her mother's demands. Waking up in the morning without a knot of dread in her stomach. It felt almost unreal, as though she were dreaming a life too good to belong to her. And yet for the first time she believed it might be possible. She was in the air, literally suspended between her old life and the one waiting ahead, and she felt as though she had been given a rare gift, a chance to reinvent herself. Angela thought back to the girl she had been not long ago, sitting alone in her apartment, staring at a phone that rang with demands, obligations, and guilt. That girl had been trapped. This woman flying over the Atlantic was free. She pressed her palm against the window as though to hold on to that truth, afraid it might slip away. But it didn't. It stayed with her, steady and certain, as the plane cut through the night sky. She wasn't just leaving Boston. She was leaving the person they had forced her to be. She was on her way to becoming someone new, someone stronger. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned her. What replaced it was something she hadn't felt in years. A daring, fragile joy. The joy of knowing her life was finally her own. Angela's flight touched down in Florida just as dawn was beginning to color the sky. By the time she stepped into the humid morning air of Key West, the horizon was painted with streaks of gold, and rose the ocean shimmering like it had been set aflame by the rising sun. She stood still for a moment outside the small terminal, her suitcase by her side, breathing in the heavy scent of salt and sea. After the cramped plane ride and the whirlwind of emotions that had carried her from Boston, the warmth of the air felt like a rebirth. It was as though every inhale washed away a little more of the bitterness clinging to her ribs, and every exhale made room for something sharper, steadier resolve. She had not come here for leisure. She had come to fight her quiet war. Her taxi wound through narrow streets lined with pastel-colored houses and flowering bougainvillea spilling over white fences. Palm trees bent gently in the morning breeze, their shadows long against the pavement. Key West seemed to pulse with calm, as if the entire island had agreed upon peace. Angela gazed out the window, aware of the irony. She was entering a place celebrated for its ease and beauty, but inside her chest a storm brewed that no tropical sunrise could soothe. By the time the taxi pulled up to the small resort she had chosen, she already felt the tension between the world outside and the fire within. The staff welcomed her with practiced smiles and a glass of cold water. She returned the smile politely, though it never reached her eyes. In her mind, she was already at work. Her room overlooked the sea. The balcony door opened onto a wide view of endless blue, the water so clear she could see fish darting beneath the surface, even from that distance. Angela rolled her suitcase into the corner and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, her laptop bag resting across her knees. The temptation to collapse, to let the island's beauty cradle her into forgetting, was strong, but she had not bought this one-way ticket for indulgence. She rose, carried her laptop out to the balcony, and set it down on the small wooden table. The waves lapped steadily against the pylons below, a sound as soothing as a lullaby. Yet when Angela opened the lid of her computer, the glow of the screen was cold, sharp, purposeful. She pulled up her bank accounts, her fingers moving with steady precision over the keys. For years, she had been the silent architect of her family's comfortable lives, their bills paid on time, not because of their effort, but because of her endless sacrifice. Now she would dismantle that comfort piece by piece. She began with the joint credit card account her parents relied upon. It had been her safety net, for them, an invisible tether that bailed them out again and again. Her cursor hovered briefly over the freeze account option, and for a moment she thought of her father's quiet gratitude years ago after she paid for his surgery. But just as quickly the memory of her mother's cold ultimatum replayed in her mind, and she clicked. The confirmation message blinked on the screen. Account frozen. Angela's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Next, she navigated to the automatic bill payments. Electricity, water, internet, the very basics of daily living. She had kept their lights burning, their faucets flowing, their television humming, and they had never once said thank you. Line by line, she canceled each payment. The system confirmed her choices with sterile efficiency, as though it didn't fully comprehend the ripple effect these simple clicks would cause. Angela did. She imagined her mother turning on a lamp only to be met with darkness, Crystal shrieking when her internet stopped, her credit card declined at a boutique counter. Each scenario filled Angela with a grim satisfaction. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was balance. It was consequence. For the first time in her life, she was letting them feel what it was like to live without her. The morning sun climbed higher, scattering diamonds across the waves, but Angela barely noticed. Her focus was absolute, her hands steady as she built the framework of her retaliation. When she closed the laptop, the silence of the island pressed against her soft and serene, but her mind hummed with the certainty of what she had just done. She sat back in her chair watching a seagull wheel overhead and whispered to herself, "This isn't a vacation. This is a battlefield." The words hung in the air, fragile yet fierce like a vow. She knew there would be repercussions, calls, accusations, perhaps even threats, but she no longer trembled at the thought. Her family had drawn the line when they demanded her money and her silence. Now she had drawn hers, and she intended never to cross it again. She leaned against the railing of the balcony, gazing down at the turquoise water below. Families laughed on the beach, children ran barefoot across the sand. Couples strolled hand in hand. Angela watched them with a detachment born from years of exclusion. Those people lived in worlds of belonging and affection, things she had only pretended to know. But she was not envious. Not anymore. She was building something different, something sharper, forged out of the years she had been ignored and used. Her solitude was no longer a burden. It was armor. And today, with the sun rising higher over Key West, she felt that armor settle into place. When she finally rose from her chair and stepped back into the room Angela carried with her, the strange duality of the island, the peace of the sea and the fire of her resolve. She pulled the curtains shut, shutting out the view that might soften her, and sat once more at the desk. Her family's world had always been built on her unacknowledged support. Now she had removed the foundation. Soon they would feel the ground beneath them crack. And when they called as she knew they would, she would not answer. She would be here in this unlikely paradise watching their tower crumble from afar. Angela woke early the next morning, the tropical light streaming through the slats of her balcony curtains. For a brief instant, she allowed herself to savor the warmth on her face, the sound of the surf rolling in steady rhythms, the illusion that she was just another guest at the resort. But as soon as her eyes fell on the laptop sitting closed on the desk, the illusion vanished. She had not come here to rest. She had come here to strike the first blow. The night before, she had laid the groundwork. Today, she would make it real. She carried the laptop back to the balcony table and opened it with deliberate calm. The screen flickered to life, its pale glow at odds with the blazing morning sun. Her hands hovered briefly over the keyboard as if she were steadying herself for a dive into cold water. Then she began. First, the joint credit card account her parents leaned on whenever they found themselves strapped groceries vacations, little emergencies that seemed to happen every other week. She had been the invisible safety net for so long, the one who patched the holes they pretended weren't there. Her cursor landed on the freeze account option. A small dialog box appeared asking her to confirm. She clicked yes. It was done. A single keystroke severed a lifeline her parents had taken for granted for years. Next came Crystal's accounts. Her sister had been added as an authorized user on one of Angela's own credit lines, a decision Angela had justified years ago as temporary. Temporary had stretched into permanent, and permanent had hardened into entitlement. Today, entitlement met its end. Angela navigated to the Authorized Users tab, selected Crystal's name, and removed it with a simple click. She could almost hear Crystal's shriek of disbelief when her card was declined, her fury when she realized her big sister had quietly stepped out of the role of provider. The thought brought a bitter smile to Angela's lips. But she wasn't finished. She opened the portal to the utilities she had been paying month after month. Electricity, water, internet. The unglamorous expenses that kept a household running. For years, her payments had been invisible threads holding together the illusion of stability her parents boasted about. With steady hands, she cut those threads one by one. Cancel payment. Cancel payment. Cancel payment. Each confirmation message blinked back at her in sterile language, and yet to Angela, each one sounded like a crack of thunder across the family home. She pictured her mother flipping a light switch and finding nothing, Crystal screaming when her video calls failed the silence of a deadline where there had always been noise. The image did not fill her with guilt. It filled her with a quiet satisfaction she had never known before. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and waited for the flood of emails. They arrived within minutes, system-generated confirmations that the transactions had been canceled, that the services were no longer supported. Angela scrolled through them slowly, almost ceremonially. Line after line of bureaucratic language spelled out the collapse of her family's comfort. She let the corner of her mouth curl upward as she imagined the chaos these sterile sentences would ignite back in Boston. For once, she was the one holding the power. For once, they were the ones left scrambling. Still, as she closed her inbox and sat staring out at the horizon, a shadow passed through her. It came unbidden in the shape of her mother's face. Not the cold, hard-eyed woman who had demanded $20,000 as though it were pocket change, but the mother of Angela's earliest memories. The woman who had once sung softly while folding laundry, who had pressed a cool hand to her fevered forehead when she was a child. Those memories rose like ghosts, softening the edges of Angela's anger for a brief, dangerous moment. She wondered if she had gone too far. She wondered if she had become the very thing she despised, merciless, punishing, unyielding. She pressed her palms together and closed her eyes, letting the sound of the waves anchor her. She reminded herself of the humiliations, the way her mother had twisted her sacrifices into obligations, the way she had been told her worth was nothing without money. The tenderness of childhood was real, yes, but it had been buried under years of cruelty and exploitation. A mother's hand on a fevered brow did not erase the sting of being told you were invisible unless you paid your way into relevance. The love she remembered had been conditional, and she was no longer willing to live under those conditions. Her chest tightened, but not with grief, with resolve. Angela opened her eyes and looked at the bright horizon, her face set like stone. The decisions she had made this morning were not born of malice. They were born of necessity. She had been the silent foundation of their lives for too long. Now she had pulled that foundation away, and they would feel the hollow beneath their feet. There was no turning back, no softening the blow. To step back into their grip would be to erase the courage she had found in herself. She whispered the truth aloud, her voice low but steady. I don't owe them anything anymore. And as she said it, she believed it. Angela's phone began to vibrate before noon. At first it was a single buzz, then another, the kind of interruptions she had grown accustomed to over the years. But this time she didn't reach for it with the urgency of a daughter conditioned to respond. She let it rattle against the wooden balcony table while she reclined in her chair, the rim of a chilled glass brushing her lips. The first sip of her cocktail was sharp and citrusy, the condensation dripping down her fingers, as if to remind her of where she was. Key West, not Boston, and free of their demands. The phone continued its insistent dance, buzzing, flashing, trying to pull her back into the role she had finally abandoned. When she finally glanced at the screen, the sight almost made her laugh. 72 missed calls, more than 30 unread messages. Her family, once so certain of her compliance, had turned into a storm of panic. She scrolled through the notifications one by one, her eyes scanning the words. Her mother's messages were frantic, punctuated with the clipped tone of someone unused to begging. The electricity's been shut off. Did you forget? Call immediately. Then another. The water isn't running. This must be a mistake. Fix it, Angela. Crystal's texts carried a different flavor, raw and cutting. My card was just declined at the checkout. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Fix it now. Another followed minutes later, less composed. "This is your fault. You've ruined everything. Don't think you can walk away from us." The desperation bled through the screen, a chorus of unraveling voices from a house that had relied on her for too long. Angela set the phone face down on the table and leaned back in her chair. She tilted her head toward the ocean, letting the sea breeze lift her hair. She imagined the chaos back in Boston, the flicker of lamps that refused to glow. Crystal's voice rising in a shriek when the faucet sputtered, her mother pacing, muttering about what the neighbors would think. She could almost hear the slamming of doors, the panicked calls to utility companies, the indignant questions from Crystal's fiancé when he realized the wedding budget was unraveling. For years, their comfort had come from her quiet labor. Now stripped of it, their world was crumbling. The image filled Angela with a rush of satisfaction, a release as intoxicating as the drink in her hand. Yet even in her moment of triumph, a sliver of something softer slipped through. She thought of the house she had grown up in, the place that smelled of laundry soap and Sunday roasts. For all its cruelty, for all its relentless comparisons, it had once been her home. There had been birthdays with cake on the kitchen table, nights when her father's low whistle echoed down the hall, mornings when her mother brushed Crystal's hair, while Angela looked on. Those memories hovered like faint apparitions, whispering that once before, money poisoned everything, there had been moments of belonging. Angela lifted the glass again and swallowed hard, trying to drown the ache that rose with those thoughts. Her phone buzzed again, dragging her back to the present. Another message from her mother. "Please, Angela, we can't manage like this. Just fix it and we'll forget what happened." Angela's jaw tightened. Forget what happened. As though the ultimatum of $20,000 had been a simple misunderstanding, as though years of using her as a bank account could be brushed aside if she just stepped back into her old role. She shook her head slowly. There was no forgetting. The ledger of their sins was written too deep. Their panic now was not her burden. It was their own reckoning. Angela stood and walked to the balcony railing, the turquoise waves stretching before her in endless calm. She held her glass aloft for a moment, as though toasting the distant chaos she had unleashed. Then she drained it, savoring the sting. She thought about her mother's pleas and Crystal's fury, and she realized something profound. She no longer felt compelled to respond. For the first time in her life, their desperation did not dictate her actions. Their house might be a storm of slammed doors and raised voices, but here above the lapping sea, she was still. She was free. A gull wheeled overhead, its cry sharp against the sound of surf. Angela followed it with her eyes and felt the faintest pang of sorrow. Families were supposed to be safety nets, not cages. But her family had chosen control, and control had a cost. Now they were paying it. She set the empty glass down and returned to her chair, pulling her knees up and folding herself into the sunlight. She let the phone buzz itself into silence, each vibration another note in a symphony of collapse. She did not answer. She would not answer. She sat in Key West, watching the ocean breathe in and out while the house she once called home dissolved into chaos without her. Angela's phone lay silent on the table for the first time in hours. The endless stream of missed calls and desperate texts had tapered off, replaced by a tense quiet that almost unnerved her more than the noise. She sat on her balcony in Key West, a glass of iced tea in hand, watching the horizon blur into late afternoon haze. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to think that perhaps they had given up, that the storm had passed. But when curiosity pulled her toward her phone again, it wasn't her inbox that caught her attention. It was a notification from social media. She hadn't planned on opening it, but something in her gut told her she should. Crystal's smiling face filled the screen. Her younger sister stood before a gilded mirror in a wedding boutique, draped in a lace gown that sparkled under soft lighting. The caption read, "Dreams do come true. Countdown to forever." Dozens of comments tumbled beneath it, each one dripping with admiration. "You look like a queen," wrote one friend. "That ring is stunning." Another added her words, punctuated with heart emojis. Angela's throat tightened as she swiped to the next post. There was Crystal again, perched on the edge of a king-sized bed in a luxury hotel suite, champagne flute in hand, the city skyline glittering behind her. Another caption. A sneak peek at our honeymoon suite. Thank you, David, for giving me the life I deserve. Angela's jaw clenched. That ring, that dress, that hotel suite, they were not gifts from David. They were built on her sacrifices, her years of siphoning away her own comfort to keep her sister afloat. Every compliment Crystal received, every envious sigh from her friends, was rooted in Angela's invisible contributions. She scrolled further, her chest burning. Pictures of Crystal dining in expensive restaurants, holding designer handbags, laughing at rooftop bars. It was all there, neatly curated to present an image of effortless luxury. And every image was a lie, a performance staged on the stage Angela had been forced to fund. For a moment, Angela considered putting the phone down, walking away from the screen and letting the charade continue. But the sight of Crystal's triumphant smirk in those photographs, the way she leaned into the camera as if daring the world to admire her, ignited something sharp inside. Angela pressed the side button and captured screenshots one after another until her photo gallery was filled with the evidence of Crystal's deception. It wasn't enough to know the truth herself anymore. She needed the world to see it. The comments stung most of all, friends and acquaintances praising Crystal's independence, admiring her hard work, paying off, congratulating her on finding a man who could provide such luxury. Angela almost laughed aloud at the irony. Crystal had never worked hard for anything in her life. The man who provided was not David. It had been Angela all along, the unseen hand that had kept Crystal's life shiny and enviable. She scrolled slowly through the thread, her mind already turning. What would happen if the curtain were pulled back? What would happen if Crystal's admirers saw the real cost of her splendor? Angela leaned back in her chair and set the phone down beside her laptop. The sound of waves below was soft, almost lulling, but her thoughts were electric. She opened a blank note and began to type. At first, the words came haltingly cautious and careful, as though she were dipping her toes into icy water, but then they flowed sharp and deliberate. She wrote about the way appearances could deceive, how some dreams were funded by the sacrifices of others, how silence could be mistaken for weakness. She didn't name Crystal directly, not yet. The words were threaded with ambiguity, designed to prick at the curiosity of anyone who read them. It's funny how the people who shine brightest are often standing on the shoulders of those they pretend not to see. She stared at the sentence for a long time, her fingers poised above the keyboard. She imagined Crystal reading it, feeling the ground shift beneath her perfect facade. She imagined their mutual friends, those who had fawned over Crystal's posts, pausing, wondering, asking questions. The thought filled Angela with a fierce satisfaction. This was not yet the revelation. That would come later at the perfect moment. But this was the first ripple, the first hint of truth, seeping into the carefully polished image her sister had built. Before she hit save, Angela took another sip of her drink and looked out at the fading horizon. The ocean was endless, serene, indifferent to human lies and dramas. But in that serenity, Angela found her own strength. She wasn't a ghost anymore, not the invisible sister who quietly paid the bills. She was a woman with evidence, with truth, and with a plan. Tonight, she would let her words hang like smoke, curling into the spaces where Crystal believed herself untouchable. Tomorrow, she would be ready to fan the flames. Angela closed her phone and set it aside after drafting her cryptic social media post. The words she had written lingered in her mind like an ember glowing faintly, but with the promise of fire. Yet as satisfying as it had felt to type them, she knew whispers alone would never be enough. Her family had thrived for too long on denial, on rewriting the past to suit their narrative. If she truly meant to unmask them, she would need something undeniable, something that would strip away every excuse and silence every protest. She needed the truth written down in cold numbers, the kind that could not be twisted into gossip or dismissed as jealousy. She pulled her laptop close and opened a new spreadsheet, the familiar grid of blank cells stretching across the screen. She stared at the emptiness for a moment, the cursor blinking like a challenge. Then she typed the words across the top, the family ledger. Her chest tightened at the sight of it, both a declaration and an indictment. For years, she had been the family's invisible accountant, paying their debts, covering their gaps, patching holes in their lives with her own earnings. Tonight, she would make the invisible visible. Her fingers moved slowly at first, tracing back through her memory, pulling each act of sacrifice into focus. She began with her father's surgery. She remembered the night she had rushed to the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the weight of the doctor's words insurance would cover most of it, but not all. The unpaid balance had been $15,000, a number that had nearly emptied her savings. She typed it into the first row, medical expenses, dad's surgery, $15,000. For a moment, she sat still, recalling how her mother's eyes had brimmed with relief when Angela handed over the money. Yet that gratitude had evaporated within weeks, replaced by new demands. Seeing the figure in black and white reignited the bitterness that had carried her this far. Next came Crystal's debts. Angela opened her email archives and scrolled until she found the old receipts, each one a reminder of how Crystal's recklessness had become Angela's responsibility. $10,000 spread across years of credit card balances, rent shortfalls, and frivolous purchases disguised as emergencies. She typed each category in its own row: credit card payoff, $3,500; rent support, $2,000; shopping debts, $4,500. The total glared back at her, $10,000. She could almost hear Crystal's dismissive voice insisting she would pay it back when her career as a consultant finally took off. That career had never materialized, but Angela's money had always been real enough. Finally, she turned to the bills. She pulled up her bank statements, scrolling through the long list of automatic payments. Water, electricity, gas, internet, month after month for years. Each one small enough to seem insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a staggering total. She highlighted every line, her eyes following the numbers, as if retracing footsteps across a barren landscape. The figure that emerged made her stomach twist: $25,000. She typed it into the spreadsheet and leaned back, the sum staring at her like a verdict. When she added the columns together, the total leapt off the screen: $50,000. Half a lifetime of labor. Half a lifetime of being erased, of being the scaffolding her family stood on without ever glancing down. She sat frozen for a moment, her hands pressed against the table, the sound of the ocean muted by the pounding in her ears. Then she drew a long breath and whispered aloud, "No one can deny this." The words steadied her. The ledger was more than a spreadsheet. It was her shield, her weapon, her testimony. Angela spent the next hours refining it. She double-checked every number, every receipt, cross-referencing her records to ensure accuracy. There could be no cracks, no opportunity for her mother or sister to sneer that she had exaggerated. This had to be airtight. She formatted the columns, neatly labeled each entry with dates and descriptions, and bolded the totals. It looked almost professional, like the kind of audit she would prepare at work. Except this audit wasn't for a corporation, it was for her family, and it was damning. When she was satisfied, she connected her laptop to the resort's small printer. The whir of the machine filled the quiet room as pages slid into the tray one after another. She stacked them carefully, her hands trembling as she held the weight of her proof. Then she slid the pages into a slim folder, the kind she had once used for job interviews, and smoothed the cover with her palm. On the front, in block letters, she wrote with a pen she had brought from Boston Family Ledger. The ink bled slightly into the paper, the words stark and permanent. Angela carried the folder to the balcony and laid it on the table beside her half-empty glass. She gazed at it under the fading light of the evening, the ocean reflecting the first stars above. For years, she had begged for recognition for her family, to simply admit what she had done for them. They had given her nothing. Now she had given herself something better, indisputable evidence. She traced her finger across the folder's edge and felt a swell of power she had never known. This was no longer about whether they believed her. It was about showing the world the truth. As night fell over Key West, Angela leaned back in her chair, the ledger at her side like a loyal companion. She could almost see the wedding ahead, the glittering hall, the smug smile on Crystal's face. She imagined herself walking in folder in hand, calm and unshaken. The vision steadied her. She no longer feared their accusations or their attempts to twist reality. The truth was hers now, and it was sharper than any insult they could hurl. The waves whispered below her balcony, carrying her vow into the darkness. She would no longer be the silent one. At the wedding, the truth would finally speak for her. Angela had barely closed her laptop after printing the last pages of her meticulously built family ledger when her phone began to buzz. At first, she thought it was another wave of desperate calls from her mother or Crystal about their power outage and unpaid bills. But this was different. These were messages from old acquaintances, co-workers from her early years, even a college friend she had not spoken to in years. Each message carried a tone of confusion, pity, or suspicion. "Angela, I heard some things. Are you okay? Someone told me you've been drowning in debt and had a breakdown. Is that true?" Her chest tightened as the words repeated on the screen. Debt, breakdown, jealousy. The accusations were not random. They were crafted deliberate and designed to destroy her credibility before she could reveal the truth. Angela sat back in her chair, the sea breeze from her open balcony drifting across her skin. Her instincts told her immediately where this smear campaign had begun: Crystal and their mother. The same two people who had demanded she hand over $20,000 now sought to strip away her dignity with gossip. She could almost hear Crystal's mocking tone spinning tales at luncheons, or whispered in the groom's family's ear. Angela, the bitter sister, mentally unstable, drowning in financial ruin, lashing out because she could not bear Crystal's happiness. It was cruel, but more than that, it was calculated. They were getting ahead of the story, poisoning the well, so that when Angela finally exposed their dependence on her money, no one would believe her. Her first reaction was a surge of anger so sharp it left her trembling. She gripped her phone tighter than she meant to, her nails biting into her palm. How many times had she bailed Crystal out of genuine debt? How many times had she quietly covered for her mother's overspending? And now those sacrifices were twisted into lies about her own supposed failures. For a fleeting moment, Angela felt the urge to call Crystal and unleash all the fury she had pent up for decades. But she stopped herself. That would be exactly what Crystal wanted proof to wave around, that Angela was unstable, emotional, out of control. Instead, Angela forced herself to breathe. She let the anger simmer, shaping it into something harder, colder, more deliberate. The irony was bitter. Angela had always avoided confrontation, taking on burdens in silence, so no one would think badly of her. Yet here she was, the target of a carefully orchestrated smear campaign. The calls from friends and old acquaintances continued, each message another reminder that rumors spread faster than truth. She decided to answer one from Claire, a friend she trusted from college. Claire's voice on the other end was hesitant. "Angela, I didn't know who else to ask. Crystal said that you left because you couldn't handle things, and that you've been borrowing money from everyone. She even hinted you might be jealous of her wedding." Angela closed her eyes, letting the words burn into her. For a moment, she almost laughed. Borrowing money. When she had spent years giving it away, Claire Angela said evenly, her voice calm despite the storm inside. "I'm fine. More than fine. Don't believe anything Crystal or my mother tells you. They're trying to cover their tracks." She didn't elaborate. There was no point in explaining over the phone. Instead, she made a mental note of what she needed to do next. If they wanted to spread lies, she would counter with truth so undeniable it could not be ignored. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Key West's streets filled with tourists chasing the last light of day, Angela sat with her laptop once more. She opened her messages and reached out to Daniel, an old mutual friend who still moved in some of Crystal's social circles. Daniel had always been skeptical of Crystal's showy lifestyle, and Angela suspected he might have seen cracks in her carefully curated image. She typed, "Daniel, I need your help. I can't go into all the details yet, but Crystal is telling people I'm unstable. I need proof of her spending her trips. Her credit card splurges anything that shows where her money really comes from. Can you help? Daniel replied quickly, as though he had been waiting for her to reach out. Angela. I thought something was off. She bragged to a group last month about how she convinced you to cover her rent again. I have screenshots, and I can get more. Relief and gratitude surged through Angela as she read his words. For the first time since the smear campaign began, she felt the scales tipping back in her favor. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. But even with allies, Angela knew the damage was already spreading. The rumors had taken root, and every hour they went unchallenged, they grew stronger. She stared at her phone, imagining the conversations happening hundreds of miles away. Her mother, clutching her pearls, shaking her head with performative sorrow as she told the groom's family that Angela was jealous and bitter. Crystal dabbing fake tears from her eyes, painting herself as the victim of an envious sister. It made Angela's stomach twist, but it also steeled her resolve. They wanted her silenced, discredited, erased. Instead, she would become louder, sharper, undeniable. As she closed her laptop that night, Angela stepped onto her balcony and looked out at the dark sea stretching endlessly before her. The air smelled of salt and freedom, but her thoughts were far from peaceful. She understood now that this was no longer just a private family betrayal. This was war fought not with fists or shouting matches, but with narratives, perception, and proof. Her family had chosen lies as their weapon. Angela would counter with truth sharpened into a blade that would cut through every false story they told. The smear campaign, she realized, was not a setback. It was a gift. It showed her exactly how afraid they were of her exposing the truth. And if fear was already creeping into their carefully curated lives, then she knew she had the upper hand. She turned off her phone, letting the unanswered messages pile up, and whispered into the night. You think you can bury me with lies. But I've kept the receipts, and soon everyone else will see them too. Angela had grown almost numb to the endless swirl of lies her mother and Crystal had crafted, but that didn't mean the sting was gone. After the rumors began circulating, she expected only isolation and doubt. She braced herself for people turning their backs for whispers in corners and sideways glances. What she did not expect was the phone call that came late one evening as she sat on the balcony of her small hotel room in Key West, staring out at the glow of the setting sun. The number flashing on her screen was unfamiliar, and she nearly let it ring out. Something in her gut told her to answer. The voice on the other end was warm but nervous, belonging to Anna, a cousin from the groom's side of the family. They had met only briefly at a family gathering months earlier, just long enough for Angela to remember Anna as kind and observant. I hope you don't mind me calling. Anna began, her tone tentative. I know this might seem out of the blue, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Your name has been dragged through the mud these past days, and I think you deserve to know what's being said, and the truth that some of us have seen with our own eyes. Angela felt her breath catch her grip tightening on the phone. She had grown so used to betrayal that trust felt foreign, almost suspect. What do you mean? She asked cautiously. Anna hesitated before continuing. Your sister and your mother, they're telling everyone at the pre-wedding dinners that you've gone off the rails. They've painted you as unstable, jealous, even dangerous. Some of David's relatives are worried, asking whether you might show up and cause a scene, but I don't believe a word of it. And I have proof that their story doesn't add up. With those words, Anna forwarded Angela a series of screenshots. As Angela opened them, her heart pounded. They were text messages from Crystal to a friend bragging openly about how much money Angela had given her. Crystal had written with smug confidence about Angela paying off her credit cards, covering the family bills, even funding her vacations. One message read, It's not my fault Angela doesn't know how to say no. She's basically my bank. Without her, I'd be screwed. Another message crowed about the upcoming wedding. Angela's footing the bill again, even if she doesn't know it. She always comes through. Angela's eyes burned as she read each line. Rage mingled with relief, finally undeniable evidence that exposed the truth. It was one thing for her to hold her meticulous ledger of transactions. It was another to have Crystal's own words boastfully admitting to the exploitation. She leaned back in her chair, the ocean breeze brushing her face as she absorbed the weight of it all. "Why are you helping me?" Angela finally asked, her voice quiet, almost breaking. Anna didn't hesitate. "Because I've seen how Crystal behaves. I've heard her laugh about you behind your back, treating you like nothing more than a resource. It's wrong, and it's cruel. You deserve to be heard, Angela. You deserve to fight back." The sincerity in Anna's voice pierced through Angela's hardened defenses. For so long she had felt alone in her battle, convinced that every relative, every family friend had chosen Crystal's side. Now, for the first time, someone from outside the immediate family was offering support, unasked, genuine, and brave. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, clutching the phone to her ear as a flood of emotions washed over her. Gratitude, sorrow, determination, they all collided into one burning flame. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "You don't know how much this means to me. I thought I was fighting this war on my own." Anna's voice grew firmer. "You're not alone anymore. Use those screenshots. Use your ledger. When the time comes, don't be afraid to show the truth. People will listen if you stand tall. I'll back you up if anyone questions it." After the call ended, Angela sat in silence for a long time, the phone heavy in her hand. The world around her was serene, the gentle crash of waves, the fading hues of twilight, but inside she felt a storm gathering strength. The lies her mother and Crystal had spun were already beginning to unravel thread by thread. Now armed with Crystal's own words and a newfound ally, Angela no longer felt like the isolated victim she had been for so many years. She was no longer a daughter begging for scraps of affection, no longer the invisible provider. She was a woman preparing to reclaim her power. Her thoughts turned to the upcoming wedding, that grand stage Crystal and her mother had so carefully prepared to showcase perfection. Angela's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. With Anna's evidence in hand, and her own ledger ready, the wedding would become something else entirely, not a celebration of Crystal's triumph, but a reckoning. The fear that had lingered in her heart began to dissolve, replaced by a resolute calm. For the first time, Angela knew she would not walk into that ballroom alone. She had allies, she had proof, and she had truth on her side. The balance of power had begun to shift, and Angela was ready to seize it. Angela had spent the night after Anna's call lying awake, her mind spinning like a carousel she couldn't step off. The screenshots Anna had sent her were seared into her brain, Crystal's arrogant words bragging about draining her sister dry, mocking her generosity as weakness. That truth, paired with the ledger she had built and the years of silent sacrifices she had borne, gave her a weapon sharper than any insult. For the first time in her life, Angela felt that the balance of power was shifting. But with that power came a responsibility she did not take lightly. If she was going to confront her family, she had to do it in a way that left no room for doubt. The thought of the wedding loomed larger with every passing hour. Crystal and her mother had staged it as a pageant of perfection, a performance meant to dazzle the groom's family and the community. Angela knew that walking into that ballroom would feel like stepping into enemy territory, but she also knew she couldn't let fear stop her. She began her preparations not with anger, but with calm precision, as though she were a soldier lacing her boots before battle. The first step was her appearance. She wanted to project dignity, strength, and composure, not the disheveled caricature her family was painting in their rumors. She went to a small boutique near her hotel and spent hours moving between racks of dresses, touching fabrics, examining cuts. Eventually, her hand landed on a dress that seemed to call out to her, a sapphire blue gown, simple in its lines, but elegant in its presence. It was neither loud nor ostentatious. Instead, it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. When she slipped it on in the fitting room, she caught her reflection in the mirror, and for the first time in years, she saw not the invisible daughter, not the scapegoat, not the bank account. She saw herself. Angela, strong, unyielding, ready. She purchased the dress, a modest pair of shoes, and a small clutch to carry the one item more important than anything else, her ledger. Back in her hotel room, she laid everything out on the bed as though she were preparing sacred tools. The ledger sat in the center, a neat folder filled with pages of figures, receipts, and statements. She opened it again, even though she had memorized every number. $15,000 for her father's surgery. $10,000 to bail Crystal out of her reckless spending. $25,000 in utilities and bills that had kept the lights on the water running and the roof over their heads. Each line was a story, each total a memory of sacrifice made in silence. She traced her fingers over the pages, feeling the weight of years she had carried alone. But now those pages were no longer burdens, they were weapons of truth. She rehearsed in her mind how she might present it. She would not scream, she would not beg. She would stand calm and steady and place the ledger in the right hands at the right time. She imagined Crystal's smug smile collapsing when confronted by her own words and by the irrefutable evidence Angela had compiled. The thought gave her a cold, steady fire in her chest. As the hours slipped away, she sat at the desk by the window, staring out at the ocean waves rolling against the shore. Her nerves fluttered, but beneath them was a resolve as unyielding as stone. She whispered to herself as though saying it aloud could anchor her courage. I am not going to this wedding as a guest. I am going to end this charade. The words settled into her bones, firm and unshakable. She closed the ledger and slipped it into her clutch, practicing the motion until it felt natural, seamless. Everything about her preparation became deliberate, ritualistic. She pressed her dress, polished her shoes, and even rehearsed walking across the room with her head held high, her steps measured and unwavering. She imagined the silence that would fall when she entered the ballroom, the shock in her mother's eyes, the fear in Crystal's. She knew they would try to shout her down, to dismiss her, to make her look unstable. But this time, Angela would not falter. The truth would stand taller than any lie. As the evening deepened, she set everything neatly aside and allowed herself one final moment of vulnerability. She sat on the edge of the bed, clasped her hands, and closed her eyes. The faces of her past rose unbidden, her younger self struggling to pay bills, the nights she stayed up late working double shifts, the ache in her chest when her sacrifices were dismissed or forgotten. She let those memories wash over her, not to weaken her, but to remind her why she was doing this. She was not fighting for revenge alone. She was fighting for the dignity she had been denied, for the recognition that she mattered, for the right to exist as more than just the shadow behind Crystal's spotlight. When she opened her eyes again, there was no trace of hesitation. The fear that had haunted her for so long had given way to clarity. She stood, smoothed the fabric of the blue dress where it hung on its hanger, and whispered almost like a vow, "Tomorrow everything changes." With that, Angela climbed into bed, her ledger safely tucked in her clutch on the nightstand beside her. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was not restless. It was the deep, steady sleep of someone who knows that in the morning she will finally reclaim her voice. Angela awoke the next morning with her mind steady and her heart anchored by determination. The dress, the ledger, the plan, they were all in place. Yet beneath her resolve was a flicker of something deeper, a longing for affirmation that she had made the right choices, that she was not simply throwing herself into chaos out of anger. As the hours until the wedding shortened, she felt the need to hear from someone who had always seen her differently from her family, someone who had offered guidance without judgment. That someone was Grace Henderson, her former boss in Boston, a woman she respected perhaps more than anyone else in her life. Grace was in her early 60s, sharp as steel and warm at her core, the kind of leader who demanded excellence, but also cared about the people behind the numbers. Angela had worked under her at Harbor Financial Solutions for years, and though Grace never pried into her personal life, she had always sensed Angela's quiet burdens. Angela remembered one conversation in particular, months before everything unraveled, when Grace had told her over coffee, "You have to start living for yourself, Angela. Sacrificing endlessly for people who don't value you will only hollow you out." At the time, Angela had nodded politely, still too bound by guilt to believe those words. Now, standing on the threshold of exposing her family's lies, she realized Grace had been right all along. Angela dialed the familiar number, her palms slightly damp, as if she were a younger employee again, about to report to her superior. Grace answered quickly, her voice calm and strong. "Angela," she said warmly, "I've been wondering when you'd call." The sound of that greeting nearly undid Angela. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she replied, "Grace, I needed to hear a voice that makes sense of things. Everything is about to come to a head, and I need to know I'm not crazy for doing this." Grace let her speak, patient as ever, as Angela poured out the story she had kept inside the ultimatum for $20,000. The years of sacrifices erased the rumors, the decision to walk away, and finally the plan to bring the ledger to Crystal's wedding. There was no interruption, only quiet affirmations on the other end of the line. When Angela finally ran out of words, Grace spoke with that rare blend of firmness and compassion that had made her a mentor in more ways than one. "Angela, what you are doing is not madness, it is courage. You are standing up against years of exploitation. That takes strength most people will never find. Don't let them convince you that claiming your dignity is wrong." Angela closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, but it was not the tear of despair. It was relief, the kind that comes when someone finally affirms what you have known in your heart, but doubted in your mind. "You really think I can do this?" she asked quietly. Grace chuckled softly. "Angela, I've always thought you were capable of more than even you knew. Do you remember telling me once you dreamed of going to business school, maybe even Harvard? You dismissed it because you thought your family needed you. Well, now that you've stepped away, I want you to finally pursue it. In fact, I'll write you a letter of recommendation myself. They would be lucky to have someone with your resilience and clarity." Angela sat up straighter, the words filling her with a sense of validation she had never received from the people who should have given it most freely. To hear Grace not only believe in her but actively promise to support her opened a door she had long assumed was sealed shut. The ledger she carried was her weapon against the past, but Grace's words became her bridge to the future. For the first time, she realized that her story was not only one of revenge, it was also one of renewal. They spoke for nearly an hour, Grace asking thoughtful questions about Angela's plans, encouraging her to think beyond the wedding, beyond her family's downfall. Angela confessed her fear that even after she revealed the truth, she might still feel empty, as though victory could not fill the years of neglect. Grace reassured her with the steady wisdom of experience. "Victory doesn't erase pain," she said gently, "but it gives you the chance to build something new on your own terms. And you, Angela, are more than ready for that." When the call ended, Angela sat in silence for a long time, letting the conversation settle into her bones. The weight of loneliness she had carried for years felt lighter. She no longer felt like a solitary figure storming into battle. Instead, she felt like a woman standing on solid ground with at least one unwavering ally who believed in her unconditionally. The knowledge that someone of Grace's stature saw her worth gave Angela a strength even her anger could not provide. She walked to the window and looked out at the horizon, where the sky was beginning to darken into shades of violet and gold. The dress hung neatly. The ledger waited quietly in her clutch, but now there was something more within her. There was a certainty that she was not only going to end a toxic cycle, but also step into the future she had been denied for so long. The affirmation of Grace's faith in her acted like armor around her heart. For the first time in her life, Angela felt that she was not invisible, not expendable, not simply the shadow behind Crystal. She was a woman with power and with people who believed in her. As she turned from the window, Angela whispered to herself, echoing Grace's encouragement. "This is not just about ending something, it's about beginning again." And with that, her determination to face the wedding solidified not as an act of vengeance alone, but as the first step toward reclaiming her own destiny. Angela felt steadier after speaking with Grace, as though someone had slipped a solid beam beneath the shaky foundation of her courage. Yet even with that renewed strength, a hollowness lingered deep inside her chest, one tied not to her mother or Crystal, but to the man who had stood by silently through so much of her suffering. Her father had never been cruel to her in the overt ways her mother and sister were. His weapon was quieter silence, passivity, and the absence of defense. It had left Angela questioning whether he truly saw her, whether he even cared enough to notice what she endured. That question had gnawed at her for years, but she had trained herself not to expect an answer. The answer, however, came in a way she never anticipated. Late one afternoon, as she returned to her hotel room in Key West, the front desk clerk stopped her with a small envelope. "This was left for you, Ms. Williams," he said politely, handing it over. Angela blinked in confusion. She hadn't told anyone outside her tight circle where she was staying. The clerk added, "A friend of your father's dropped it off this morning." Her hands trembled as she took it, her heart pounding. For a moment she debated tossing it aside, fearful of what manipulation might be inside. But curiosity and perhaps longing won out. She climbed the stairs to her room, shut the door, and sat at the edge of the bed before opening it. Inside was a folded letter and a single sheet of paper, a copy of the hospital bill from years earlier, the one Angela had drained her savings to pay for during her father's cardiac surgery. Her throat tightened instantly, memories rushing back of the night she wrote that check, of the panic in her parents' voices, of the silence that followed when repayment never came. Clipped to the bill was her father's handwriting, shaky but deliberate. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the words slowly. "My Angela," it began, and just seeing the words made tears sting the corners of her eyes. "I have carried guilt for years that I never spoke up, never defended you against your mother's sharp tongue or your sister's selfishness. I was too weak, too afraid of disrupting the fragile peace in our house. But I was never blind. I knew who kept us afloat. I knew that the reason I survived that surgery was because of you. I should have said thank you 1,000 times, but instead I let your mother silence me. That is my shame, not yours." Angela's hands shook as she held the page. She read on each line, cutting and healing at once. "You were never invisible to me. I saw you work late into the night. I saw you quietly paying bills that weren't yours. I let you bear weight no daughter should have to carry. And I let you believe I didn't notice. I am sorry. Truly sorry. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that your sacrifices were not forgotten. They saved me, and I will carry that truth until my last breath." Her breath hitched, and she pressed the paper to her chest, rocking slightly as if to steady herself. The words she had longed to hear all her life, that she was seen, that her sacrifices mattered, had come too late, but they were here at last. The ache of neglect warred with the relief of acknowledgement. She whispered into the empty room, "Why didn't you tell me then?" though she knew the paper could not answer. The letter closed with a simple plea. "Whatever happens at that wedding, whatever choice you make, know that I am proud of you. Proud that you had the strength I never did." Angela wept openly, her tears soaking the thin stationery. The sound was raw, but not of despair. It was the release of years of pent-up anguish, a dam finally cracking under the weight of acknowledgement. She cried for the girl she had been desperate for validation. She cried for the man who had failed her in silence yet finally found his voice too late to change the past. And she cried for herself now, a woman standing at the edge of freedom, carrying both scars and strength. When the tears slowed, she laid the letter on the bed beside her and sat up straighter. The ache remained, but it no longer hollowed her. The words of her father, frail and belated as they were, gave her something she had lacked: proof that she was not forgotten, that even behind his silence, there had been recognition. It did not absolve him, but it gave her the strange peace of knowing she had not imagined her worth. She wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and slid it into her ledger. It belonged there among the receipts and statements, a reminder that truth did not only live in numbers. Looking at the folder now heavier with her father's confession, Angela felt her determination sharpen. She would not turn back, and she would not soften her plan. If anything, his letter fueled her further. He had called her strong, and she would prove him right, not by continuing to sacrifice for others, but by standing firm for herself. She whispered into the dim light of the room, her voice steadier now. I can't go back. But I can move forward. As she slipped the ledger back into her clutch, the ocean wind rattled the balcony doors, and she let the sound fill the silence. Tomorrow she knew the war would reach its climax. And now, with her father's long-delayed acknowledgement in her hands, she carried not only anger, but also an unshakable resolve. The battle ahead was no longer just about revenge. It was about honoring the truth of who she was and refusing ever again to be unseen. Angela sat in her room long after the sun had gone down, the sound of the ocean waves muffled behind the balcony doors. The letter from her father rested inside her ledger, tucked neatly between receipts and statements, as though it had always belonged there. Its words lingered in her mind, soothing and searing all at once, but they did not distract her from what was coming. The wedding loomed ahead like a storm cloud, promising confrontation, chaos, and an end to years of silence. She knew she could not back away. Just as she closed her eyes to steady herself, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The name on the screen made her lips curl into a cold, knowing smile. It was Crystal. The message was short and sharp, written with the smug confidence Angela knew too well. Don't bother showing up tomorrow if you're not contributing. You're not welcome. Angela stared at the words, imagining her sister sending it from a room full of champagne glasses and wedding gowns, believing she had already won. Instead of anger, Angela felt an odd sense of calm. For once, the sting of Crystal's cruelty did not cut her. She typed nothing in reply. She didn't need to. Let Crystal think her warning had landed. Let her believe Angela would cower and stay away. Tomorrow her presence would strike harder than any retort she could write tonight. Angela set the phone down and allowed herself a long, slow breath. She turned to the ledger once more, opening its pages under the glow of the bedside lamp. Each line was crisp, each number etched with painstaking care. $15,000 for her father's surgery, $10,000 for Crystal's debt, $25,000 in bills. Years of sacrifices tallied neatly on paper, proof that she had carried the weight of a family that never thanked her. She traced her fingers along the margins, not because she doubted the accuracy, but because she wanted to imprint the truth deeper into her own memory. Tomorrow, these pages would no longer sit quietly in her hands. They would roar in the faces of those who had dismissed her as nothing. Angela closed the folder, her heart steady, and placed it carefully inside her clutch. She rehearsed in her mind the moment she would hand it over. She pictured Crystal's forced smile, faltering, her mother's eyes widening in panic, the murmurs of guests as the illusion of perfection shattered. The thought did not bring her glee in the way she once imagined. It brought clarity. She wasn't walking into the wedding for revenge alone. She was walking in to reclaim her place as a human being, not the invisible daughter, not the expendable sister. The hours ticked by, and at last Angela stood slipping into the blue dress she had chosen, its fabric catching the faint light like calm water before a storm. She pinned her hair back, fastened the small earrings she had kept for years, and studied herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the one her family had belittled for decades. This woman carried herself with quiet strength. Her shoulders squared, her gaze unwavering. The image gave her courage. When dawn finally came, Angela did not hesitate. She slid the clutch under her arm, pulled on her shoes, and stepped into the morning air. The streets were still sleepy, the early sun brushing everything with gold, but her stride was purposeful. With every step she shed another layer of the fear that had bound her to her family's control. She was not walking toward a wedding. She was walking into battle armed not with fists, but with truth. As she hailed a cab, her phone buzzed again with more messages from her mother, no doubt variations of the same ultimatum Crystal had sent. She didn't bother opening them. Their warnings no longer mattered. The power had already shifted. By the time she reached the airport and boarded the plane back to Boston, Angela's pulse quickened, not with dread, but with anticipation. She imagined the ballroom, the glittering chandeliers, the perfect smiles that would freeze when she walked through the doors. Settling into her seat, she glanced once more at the clutch resting on her lap. It felt heavier than its size suggested, not just with paper, but with years of silence, betrayal, and sacrifice. Now all of it would be unveiled. She leaned her head back, her eyes closing briefly as the plane lifted off the runway. When she opened them again, her reflection in the small window showed a woman poised for war. Angela knew she was stepping into hostile ground. She knew Crystal and her mother would try to twist the narrative to shout her down, to frame her as unstable in front of their carefully curated audience. But this time, Angela had no intention of shrinking. She whispered to herself, "Steady and certain I am ready." With that, she let the hum of the plane carry her toward the inevitable confrontation, her heart hardened and her resolve unshakable. By the time she would step into that ballroom, she would not be the scapegoat or the silent daughter. She would be the truth, walking straight into the lion's den. The night before had been Angela's declaration to herself that she would no longer be silent. By morning, that promise had solidified into steel. Now standing outside the Grand Hotel where Crystal's wedding was being held, she could feel the hum of wealth and indulgence, even from the sidewalk. Limousines pulled up in neat intervals, each spilling out polished guests in gowns and tuxedos. Laughter floated across the evening air like perfume mingled with the rich scent of roses. Angela adjusted the simple clutch in her hand, feeling the crisp folder of the family ledger inside. Every step she took toward the entrance felt deliberate, as though she were walking not into a celebration, but onto a stage where the truth was about to be performed. The moment she stepped inside, the grandeur of the ballroom struck her. Crystal had spared no expense, and Angela knew exactly whose money had built this spectacle. The chandeliers blazed above, scattering golden light across towering floral arrangements and crystal glasses already filled with champagne. White roses climbed archways, silk drapes shimmered in the glow, and a quartet in the corner played a refined melody. Guests buzzed around the space, their conversations lively, their laughter untroubled. It was a picture-perfect wedding, the kind Crystal had dreamed of since she was a girl, and that Angela had unintentionally financed piece by piece. Angela's eyes roamed the room until they found Crystal at the center of it all. She was resplendent, dressed in a gown of lace and tulle that seemed spun from light itself. Every hair was in place, every jewel chosen to glimmer just so. Their mother stood beside her, radiant in her pride, practically glowing as she paraded Crystal from group to group, introducing her with the delight of a queen presenting her heir. There was no doubt in the way she smiled or in the words she chose. Crystal was her masterpiece. Angela was the ghost, the shadow they had long discarded. The contrast was stark and deliberate, and that realization only sharpened Angela's resolve. None of them expected her to show her face. The whispers she had heard through friends, and the poisoned stories Crystal and their mother had spread, were meant to keep her away, to shame her into silence. In their minds, Angela was still hiding in Key West, licking her wounds in exile. That illusion was about to shatter. The hush began almost immediately when Angela stepped across the threshold of the ballroom. Her gown was a deep sapphire blue, simple but commanding in its elegance. It was not the color of a guest blending into the scenery, but of a woman choosing to stand apart. Heads turned in waves as she moved forward, her heels striking the marble floor in rhythm with the rising tension. Conversations faltered, laughter dimmed, and eyes followed her progress as though an uninvited storm had swept into the room. Angela held her head high, her gaze steady. For years she had entered family gatherings with a quiet hope of being seen, acknowledged, loved. Tonight she entered with none of those illusions. She walked as someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to reveal. She could feel the weight of the folder in her clutch, the documented truth of decades of sacrifices. Each step made her pulse beat harder, but her face betrayed no fear. She had learned long ago how to mask vulnerability, and now that skill became her armor. From across the room, Crystal's eyes found hers. For a fleeting moment, the bride's composure cracked. The bright smile froze, the laughter in her throat faltered, and the color drained from her face. She quickly recovered, clinging tighter to her groom's arm, but Angela had seen the flicker of panic. Their mother noticed too, her own expression tightening as she whispered urgently into Crystal's ear, trying to preserve the illusion of perfection. The room's mood shifted with Angela's presence. Guests leaned in toward one another, murmuring questions. Some recognized Angela from family events long past. Others only knew of her through the poisoned narrative Crystal and their mother had spun. But now seeing her stride confidently through the golden glow of the chandeliers, doubts began to stir. Was this the unstable, jealous woman they had been told about? Or was she something else entirely? Angela could feel the ripple of curiosity pressing in on her, feeding her strength. She had come to expose the truth, but already her arrival alone had cracked the polished veneer of Crystal's fairy tale. The silence deepened as she drew closer, as though the very music of the quartet was hushed by her determination. She glanced briefly at the rows of tables, each decorated with elaborate centerpieces that must have cost thousands, and thought of the nights she had skipped meals to make sure bills were paid. That contrast only fueled her steps. Near the altar where Crystal stood, poised radiant for her perfect evening, Angela paused. Every eye in the room was upon her. The tension was so thick it seemed to choke the air, the kind of silence that precedes revelation. Angela allowed it to settle, to build, to stretch unbearably, until the absence of words became its own weapon. Then, with a calmness that belied the storm within, she lifted her chin and took the final steps forward, the blue of her gown cutting through the sea of white and gold, like truth slicing through deception. In that moment, Angela was no longer the overlooked daughter, no longer the invisible provider. She was the reckoning. The room knew it, even if they did not yet understand why she had come. And as she stood there face to face with the sister who had drained her dry and the mother who had discarded her worth, Angela felt the power shift. For the first time, it was not theirs. It was hers. The ballroom glowed with golden light chandeliers scattering warmth across polished marble floors and flower arrangements so elaborate they looked as though they had been lifted from the pages of a bridal magazine. Guests murmured in admiration, sipping champagne, their eyes fixed on Crystal as she glided across the room in her pristine gown. She looked every inch the fairy tale bride, her mother basking in the reflected glow, introducing her daughter with pride to anyone within earshot. They moved through the crowd like royalty, receiving their subjects smiling and nodding, unaware of the storm about to sweep through their carefully constructed evening. At the edge of the room, Angela stood, her sapphire dress catching the light and demanding attention without effort. Heads turned. The conversations faltered. A ripple of surprise, then unease, passed through the guests as they recognized the sister who was never meant to be there. Crystal's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing when she caught sight of Angela. But before she could rush to her mother for help, Angela stepped forward with a calmness that silenced the space more effectively than a shout ever could. The sound of her heels against the marble echoed like a drumbeat. 1, 2, 3, and then she stood before the couple, her expression steady, almost serene. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every eye in the room was already on her. She extended a blue folder toward the groom and said clearly enough for all to hear, "This is my wedding gift to you." The groom. David blinked in confusion. His hand hesitated before he took the folder, perhaps expecting tickets or a letter, some personal gesture. But as he flipped open the cover and his eyes landed on the neat columns of figures, his face drained of color. Silence thickened around him as he scanned the pages, rows of bank transfers, receipts, payments made not by Crystal, but by Angela. There was her father's medical bill covered in full. There were thousands spent on utilities, credit card balances, luxury expenses, all linked back to Crystal's name. The numbers left no room for argument. They screamed the truth louder than any speech could. David's breathing quickened. His fingers tightened around the papers until they crumpled slightly. He turned sharply to Crystal, his voice rough and low but loud enough to carry. "Is this true? All this money, was it hers?" Crystal's face went pale under the layers of makeup. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her eyes darted to her mother, who stepped forward instinctively, ready to dismiss or excuse, but Angela raised her chin and met their gaze head-on. Guests began to whisper. "What's going on?" someone near the back asked. Another leaned over, murmuring, "That's her sister, isn't it?" The one they always said was jealous. The tide of curiosity rose quickly into suspicion. A family friend near the front who had known Angela since childhood frowned and muttered, she was the one always helping her father after the surgery. I remember that. Why would she lie? David's hands shook as he flipped through more pages, the damning evidence growing with each line. 15,000 for your father's surgery, 10,000 for your cards, another 25 for bills. All of this from her. His voice cracked as he lifted his eyes back to Crystal. You told me it was your savings. You swore you had everything under control. Crystal's composure shattered. It's not what it looks like. She stammered, her words brittle and desperate. She's twisting it. She wanted to help, that's all. She volunteered. But her protests rang hollow against the cold clarity of the ledger. Angela stood still, her calm in stark contrast to Crystal's unraveling. She did not gloat. She did not shout. Her silence carried more weight than any outburst could. The crowd's whispers swelled, rippling through the room like wind through dry leaves. She used her sister's money for all of this, even the ring. What kind of family does that? Angela could feel the momentum shifting, the carefully polished facade of her sister's life collapsing under the weight of truth. Every guest present had seen the figures, had witnessed David's shock, had heard the question he hurled that Crystal could not answer. This was not a private accusation whispered in a corner. This was exposure undeniable and public. David dropped the folder onto a nearby table, the papers spilling out, fluttering like leaves across the floor. He ran a hand through his hair, his face twisted in disbelief and fury. This isn't just about money, he said hoarsely. It's about trust, about lies, about building an entire marriage on someone else's sacrifice. How could you? Crystal reached for him, tears smudging her makeup, but he stepped back as though her touch might burn him. His rejection sent a murmur of shock through the crowd, but no one stepped in to rescue her. For once, Crystal's charm failed. Her mother's attempts to hush the whispers fell flat, drowned by the rising hum of judgment. Angela finally spoke again, her voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. This wedding isn't built on love. It's built on theft. Every flower, every candle, every stitch of that gown, you owe it all to me. And tonight, everyone knows it. Gasps followed her words. Guests turned, some in disbelief, others in quiet admiration. Angela did not stay to argue. She had no need. The evidence spoke louder than her voice ever could. She stepped back, her eyes never leaving her sister's, watching as panic set in, and the perfect image Crystal had cultivated cracked beyond repair. The chaos was only beginning. The ledger had done its work. The guests' voices rose 100 private judgments spilling into the open air. Crystal's world was collapsing in the very room she had chosen to showcase her triumph, and Angela, calm and composed, stood at the center of it all, like the eye of a storm. She knew she had delivered the blow that could not be undone. David's face hardened as he stood in front of Crystal, the open ledger still trembling in his hands. His jaw clenched, his breath uneven, and then without another word he turned on his heel and strode down the aisle toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. The crowd gasped as the groom abandoned his own wedding, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor like the toll of a funeral bell. Crystal staggered after him, clutching the skirt of her gown, crying out his name. But David didn't slow, didn't look back. He flung the doors open, and they slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the chandeliers. For a moment, silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Then voices rose all at once. The groom's parents stormed forward, faces flushed with fury. "You humiliated our son," David's mother spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She jabbed a finger toward Crystal and then toward her mother. "You're nothing but liars. Con artists parading in borrowed silk." David's father added his own venom, shaking his head with contempt. "We welcomed you into our family. We opened our doors, and this is what we get: a wedding built on deceit and stolen money. Disgraceful." His words landed like blows, each syllable stripping away the last veneer of respectability Crystal and her mother had tried to cling to. Crystal collapsed onto the steps of the altar, sobbing, her perfectly applied makeup streaking down her cheeks. She tried to defend herself, babbling through tears. "It's not true. It's not what it looks like." But no one was listening. Her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of whispers from the crowd. Some guests exchanged incredulous looks. Others turned away in disgust, while a few reached discreetly for their phones. The soft glow of screens illuminated pockets of the ballroom as photos of the scattered papers and Crystal's hysterical figure began to circulate online. Within minutes, snippets of the scene were posted, tagged and shared, spreading the collapse of the perfect Brooks wedding to a much wider audience. Angela watched as the spectacle unfolded, her expression calm, her posture steady. Her sapphire dress caught the light, making her a beacon in the sea of chaos. She didn't need to say another word. The evidence had spoken, the truth had landed, and now the fallout was consuming them without her lifting a finger. Her mother stood frozen near the front row, lips pressed tightly together, her face drained of all color. For once she had no scolding words, no excuses, no performance to save face. The accusations hurled by David's family left her mute, her reputation unraveling in front of friends and neighbors she had sought so desperately to impress. Crystal's wails grew louder as she realized no one was coming to her aid. Her friends, once eager to bask in her glow, now stepped back, whispering to one another. Some shook their heads, muttering about her arrogance. Others, less kind, laughed under their breath. The room that had once been filled with admiration for the glittering bride was now heavy with contempt. The grand stage she had envisioned for her triumph had turned into a courtroom where her crimes were laid bare. Angela stood off to the side, her eyes following the scene with a detached calm. She had braced herself for this moment for so long that now, as it unfolded, she felt an odd blend of triumph and relief. Triumph because justice was finally visible, undeniable, witnessed by all who had doubted her. Relief because she no longer had to carry the weight of secrets, sacrifices, and silence. She didn't need to scream her story into the void anymore. It had been shouted for her by the very collapse of Crystal's life. More phones rose into the air. Guests captured the bride in disarray, the furious shouts of David's parents, the silent, humiliated figure of her mother. Someone whispered, "This will be all over the internet by morning," and another replied, "It already is." The sound of fingers tapping on screens mixed with the echoes of Crystal's sobs, turning the ballroom into a strange theater of judgment. The pristine white flowers, the golden light, the champagne glasses, all of it now mocked the disaster unraveling beneath them. Angela inhaled deeply, letting the scene wash over her. She didn't smile, though a quiet satisfaction bloomed in her chest. This wasn't about gloating. It was about balance being restored, about finally standing tall without apology. She had spent years hidden in Crystal's shadow, cast as the bitter, invisible sister, the family's wallet, rather than its daughter. Now, under the chandeliers and before every eye that mattered, the truth was undeniable. She had not been the jealous one. She had been the backbone, and without her the glittering facade had crumbled to dust. Crystal, still sobbing, looked up at Angela through smeared mascara and raw fury. But there was nothing she could say to undo what had been revealed. Their mother remained motionless, a statue of defeat. David's family exited in a storm of outrage, their voices carrying one final insult. "You'll never fool anyone again." And just like that, the alliance Crystal had hoped to secure evaporated. The Brooks family name, once wrapped in a veneer of middle-class pride, now lay in tatters on the ballroom floor, alongside the scattered receipts that told the real story. Angela knew she had won. Not in cruelty, not in vengeance alone, but in truth. And standing there amidst the collapse of everything her family had tried to build on her back, she felt lighter than she had in years. The war was over. She had reclaimed her dignity, and she no longer needed anything from them. Angela stood perfectly still, letting the chaos around her settle into a heavy silence. The scattered papers of the ledger still littered the floor like fallen leaves, Crystal's sobs echoed from the altar, and their mother remained frozen in her shame. Angela's chest rose as she drew a steady breath. She turned slowly, her eyes sweeping across the ballroom, meeting the stares of dozens of faces, some shocked, some sympathetic, some already pulling away from the wreckage of a family's lies. And then, in a voice that cut through the thick silence, firm and unwavering, she declared, "I am not a wallet. I am a person." The words rang out sharp and clear, echoing off the chandeliers and polished walls. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sentence hung in the air with the weight of a verdict, one that shattered years of quiet sacrifices, unspoken resentments, and invisible wounds. Guests shifted in their seats, their faces betraying discomfort, as though they too were complicit in the way Angela had been erased. Her mother flinched at the words, her shoulders curling inward, while Crystal buried her face in her hands, unable to bear the sound of a truth spoken aloud so publicly. Angela didn't pause to explain or justify. She didn't owe them that anymore. With measured steps, she began to walk down the aisle, her heels clicking steadily against the marble. Each step felt lighter than the last, as though she were shedding a burden that had chained her for years. The murmurs of the crowd faded behind her, replaced by a thick, reverent silence. For the first time in her life, she was not walking toward her family's demands, not rushing to solve their crises, not carrying their debts on her shoulders. She was walking out for herself. The guests parted instinctively as she approached, creating a clear path. They stared not at Crystal in her ruined gown, not at the humiliated mother, but at Angela, the quiet sister who had always been invisible. Now, under the chandeliers, she commanded the room without raising her voice, without lifting her hands. Power radiated from her in a way they could not ignore. Her declaration had redrawn the lines of her identity, and every step away from the altar reinforced it. As she neared the grand doors, a sound broke the silence, a single pair of hands clapping, then another, and another. The applause was not thunderous, but it was steady, deliberate. A handful of guests rose to their feet, their faces solemn yet approving. They weren't just clapping for her revenge. They were clapping for her survival, for the courage it took to stand in front of them all and demand recognition. Each clap reverberated in Angela's chest like a promise that she was no longer unseen. Angela didn't smile, though warmth flickered in her chest. This was not about triumphalism. It was about release. For years, she had been cast as the bitter sister, the financial crutch, the shadow living behind Crystal's spotlight. Tonight, she had torn that script apart. She had shown them who she truly was, and in the process, she had set herself free. The applause swelled slightly as she reached the doors, not overwhelming, but enough to affirm her decision. A woman she vaguely remembered from childhood, a neighbor or distant cousin, caught her eye and mouthed the words, "Good for you." Angela pushed the doors open and stepped into the cool night air. The city hummed beyond the Grand Hotel, indifferent to the collapse unfolding inside. She inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs like a baptism, washing away the smoke of years spent burning for a family that never cared to notice. She looked up at the night sky stars peeking faintly through the glow of Boston's skyline and felt for the very first time truly free. The noise of the ballroom was fading behind her, now replaced by the rhythm of her own heartbeat and the steady echo of her heels on the stone steps. Every step away from that gilded prison was a declaration louder than words. She was no longer theirs to exploit, no longer their silent benefactor, no longer their scapegoat. She was her own. The applause still echoed faintly in her ears, not because of its volume, but because of what it represented. In that moment, she knew some people had truly seen her for the first time, and perhaps that was enough. She walked into the night, the weight gone from her shoulders, the ledger no longer her burden but her weapon, her voice finally unchained. The silence of freedom wrapped around her like a cloak. Angela had walked into the wedding as the forgotten daughter, the family's reluctant provider. She walked out as something far greater, a woman who had faced her oppressors in their most sacred space, spoken her truth, and left without a backward glance. For the first time, her story belonged to her. and no one, neither her mother nor her sister nor the whispers of any crowd, could take it away again. The night Angela walked out of the wedding felt like the closing of a book that had weighed her down for years. For the first time, she was no longer defined by her family's demands or Crystal's shadow. The silence of that freedom carried her through the days that followed, but it also left her with questions about what came next. She had walked away from everything she had known, but she had not walked away from herself. There was still a woman inside her who had fought, sacrificed, and endured. And now that same woman was ready to rise. Angela threw herself into her work with a determination that startled even her colleagues. Every late night spent poring over financial reports, every extra project she took on, became fuel for the vision of a new life. She signed up for preparatory courses, studied into the early hours of the morning, and sat through grueling practice exams with a resolve that came not from ambition alone, but from survival. Each page of equations, each case study she dissected was a quiet rebellion against the years she had been told she was less than. The day the envelope from Harvard arrived, Angela sat staring at it for several minutes before daring to break the seal. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with the weight of everything this letter represented. When she finally unfolded the paper and read the words, "We are pleased to offer you admission to the MBA program," her breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes as she sank into her chair, the letter pressed against her chest. For so long she had been cast aside as invisible, yet here was proof that the world saw her now, not for what she gave away, but for what she could accomplish. Moving to Cambridge felt like stepping into a second life. Her new apartment was small with bare walls and modest furnishings, but to Angela, it gleamed like a palace. It was hers, paid for with her own money, untouched by the demands or manipulations of her family. No one would call her in the middle of the night to demand payments. No one would guilt her into covering someone else's mistakes. The quiet hum of her refrigerator, the view of the Charles River from her window, the smell of fresh paint on the walls, each detail was a reminder that she had built this life with her own hands. She found joy in the little routines of independence. Brewing her coffee in the mornings, walking through Harvard Square, on her way to classes, filling her shelves with books she had chosen for herself. Each moment was a declaration that she no longer lived for others. Her classmates admired her sharp mind, her professors praised her resilience, and for the first time she didn't shrink away from recognition. She accepted it knowing she had earned it. Late at night, Angela often sat by her window with her laptop open, reflecting on how far she had come. The nights spent crying over unpaid bills, the phone calls filled with accusations, the suffocating sense of being used, they were scars. Yes, but they were also proof of survival. She looked at herself now accepted into one of the most prestigious programs in the world, free in every sense that mattered, and she felt a pride so deep it made her chest ache. There were moments when the past tried to creep back in. A memory of her father's tired smile, her mother's sharp voice, Crystal's mocking laughter. But instead of letting those memories break her, Angela let them harden her resolve. They reminded her why she had chosen this path, why she had walked out of that ballroom without looking back. Every sacrifice she had made for them had been wasted, but the fight she had waged for herself was worth everything. One evening as she walked back from class, the autumn air crisp around her and the lights of the campus glowing like lanterns, Angela paused to take it all in. Students hurried past, their arms full of books, their conversations buzzing with energy, and she realized she belonged here. Not as someone's financial crutch, not as a silent daughter, but as Angela Brooks, a woman who had carved her way through betrayal and emerged stronger. Looking back on her journey, Angela no longer saw only pain. She saw resilience, grit, and the unyielding refusal to be erased. It was as if she had been born again, not into the family that had dismissed her, but into the life she had chosen for herself. Pride and hope swelled inside her, not for what she had left behind, but for what lay ahead. The woman who had once been invisible was invisible no more. And as she sat in her apartment overlooking the Charles River, the letter from Harvard framed on her desk. Angela smiled with the certainty that her story was only just beginning. A year passed, and the rhythm of Angela's life had settled into something both demanding and deeply fulfilling. Her days were consumed with lectures, case studies, and late nights at Harvard's library, and her evenings were spent in quiet reflection inside her modest Cambridge apartment. She had built a life of independence and dignity, one that no longer carried the weight of her family's demands. With every exam she passed, with every project that bore her name, she reinforced a truth she had discovered on the night she walked out of the wedding. She was her own, and she owed nothing to anyone who tried to erase her worth. The seasons turned, and with them came whispers of her family's decline. A cousin she barely spoke to mentioned in passing that Crystal and their mother were struggling. Creditors had begun circling bills piled higher than they could manage, and the house they once flaunted as a mark of pride had slipped into foreclosure. Angela listened quietly, offering no comment. She did not gloat, nor did she intervene. Their downfall was not her doing. It was the inevitable consequence of their own choices, their reliance on the money and silence of the daughter they had cast aside. One crisp autumn evening, Angela was at her desk, reviewing notes for an upcoming seminar, when her phone lit up. The name on the screen stopped her hand mid-motion. It was her mother. For a long moment she simply stared at it, the sound of the ringtone cutting through the quiet of her apartment. She let it play once, twice, and then curiosity overcame her. She pressed the phone to her ear and answered. Her mother's voice was thin, almost unrecognizable, stripped of the sharp authority that had once ruled Angela's childhood. "Angela," she whispered, the sound trembling. "Please, we've lost the house. Crystal's debts are drowning us. We need you. Just this once, help us." In the background, Angela could hear Crystal crying, begging, their voices layered with desperation and fear. Angela closed her eyes, and for a moment the weight of memory pressed on her. She saw the ledger she had once carried like chains. She heard the mockery of her sister, the commands of her mother, the years of sacrifice made invisible. But instead of pain, she felt only clarity. These voices that had once bound her no longer had that power. A small smile curved on her lips, not cruel, but calm, resolved. She did not respond with anger. She did not list the debts she had already paid, the years she had already given. She did not need to. With a steady hand, she pulled the phone from her ear and pressed the button to end the call. The line went silent. She set the phone down on her desk, her smile lingering as the quiet of her apartment embraced her once more. There was no guilt, no heaviness in her chest. For the first time in her life, she could hear her mother's plea and feel nothing but freedom. Their struggles were theirs to bear. She had carried them long enough, and now she was done. Angela leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window where the city lights of Cambridge shimmered against the night. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her not as the overlooked daughter or the family's scapegoat, but as the woman she had fought to become. She whispered to herself, her voice steady and strong. "No one has the right to make you buy love." The words filled the room, an anthem to her journey, a truth forged in pain and sealed in triumph. As she returned to her work, the weight of her past slipped further into the shadows. She knew her family would continue to stumble, perhaps even fall completely, but it was no longer her burden to lift them. Her life was her own now, and every choice she made was a step forward into a future of her design. Angela smiled again, her heart light, her spirit unbound. She had not just survived her family, she had risen beyond them. And with each passing day, she proved that freedom, dignity, and self-worth were worth far more than any inheritance of obligation or guilt. She was free, and nothing could ever chain her again. Angela's journey shows us something powerful. Sometimes the hardest but most necessary act of love is choosing yourself. She was silenced, used, and treated as nothing more than a wallet. Yet when the moment came, she stood tall, spoke the truth, and walked away free. And in the end, the family that dismissed her learned a painful lesson. Without her, their false world crumbled. But what about you? Have you ever been taken for granted by family expected to give and give until there was nothing left? If you were in Angela's shoes, would you have done the same, walked away and let them fall? Or would you have answered that phone call even after everything? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences and feelings in the comments. Your story might be the one that speaks to someone else tonight. And if Angela's fight for freedom moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of betrayal, revenge, and resilience. Every week we bring you tales that remind us no matter how cruel the world can be, strength and justice can still be found.